Noshir Gawadia couldn't stop his hands from trembling. Each passing second, every tick of the clock's hands made the beating of his heart quicken, so much so that he could feel it thumping against his ribs. The suspense of waiting for the jury to return and issue their verdict made him almost nostalgic for the days when the most he had to worry about was getting caught. Gawadia's life could have taken such a different trajectory. He could have lived and died with a legacy, remembered for his accomplishments and nothing else. Outside of the people who knew the machines he designed, the rest of the world would have been none the wiser as to who he was. But he had fallen victim to his own greed, the human impulse to make money, and that was what had landed him in trouble. Had Gawadia known that he'd end up sat in a chair, that he'd spend the last 4 months in that very courtroom, that he'd be sat racked with anxiety over what would happen next, well, maybe he would have thought twice about sending those faxes. The door to the courtroom swung open, the tension making it sound like a deafening boom to Gawadia's ears. The jurors returned to their places, filing in and sitting down. He could feel each of their gazes locked onto him like laser-guided targeting systems. The court was called to rise for the judge, and Gawadia could feel his knees weaken as he stood up, the shuddering concealed by the desk in front of him. He could have sworn he heard one of his lawyers mutter 2 words under his breath, "Good luck." At the behest of the judge, the head juror rose. They had reached a verdict. Every second of silence that passed between the judge's questions and the jury's response felt like it lasted for several agonizing minutes, until one word cut through the terrified fog and rang out like the blast of a bombshell in Gawadia's ears. When asked, the head juror told the judge that they had found the defendant guilty. On the 10th of August 2010, a jury returned their verdict for Noshir Gawadia after a lengthy trial fraught with interruptions, both delays and attempts to stall the inevitable. In reality, there were mountains of evidence stacked against him, with very little chance that he'd manage to get away scot-free. What he'd done was not only a treasonous breach of national defense information, but also could have inadvertently changed the landscape of modern warfare technology across the entire world. So what exactly was it that led to one of the lead designers of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber landing himself in a Supermax prison with no hope for release until 2032? Well, let's start at the beginning. Noshir Gawadia was born in Mumbai, India. He would legally immigrate to the United States and obtain U.S. citizenship before eventually starting to work at Northrop Grumman Corporation in November 1968. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Northrop is a pretty big deal when it comes to aerospace engineering, both when it comes to commercially flown aircraft as well as those designed and built for military use. And Noshir Gawadia would go on to have a pretty extensive career at the company as a design engineer up until April 1986. During his time at Northrop, Gawadia would play a pivotal role in one of the company's most famous pursuits, the designing and creation of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Even if you've never heard of that particular plane before, we'd wager you've almost certainly seen one, especially given the unique design of the B-2. If you've ever seen movies like 2008's Cloverfield or Toho Pictures' Shin Godzilla from 2016, then you'll know that sometimes movie militaries will send out big bombers to take down threats, whether they're a giant monster rampaging through a major city or an alien invasion descending from above. For moments like this, Hollywood calls on the B-2. The bomber's distinctive shape has made it one of the most instantly recognized military aircraft in the world, as have its various appearances on screen, including cameos in Independence Day, Armageddon, Rampage, and Captain Marvel, as well as the previously mentioned giant monster movies. Even a few video games have featured appearances from the bomber. You'll definitely be familiar with the B-2 if you're a fan of the first-person shooter series Call of Duty Modern Warfare, where the plane appears as the appropriately named stealth bomber Killstreak. As mentioned, what makes the B-2 so instantly recognizable is its unique silhouette. While not the only plane to be designed and built in this configuration, the B-2 is what's known as a flying wing. Where other planes have a fuselage and a tail at the rear, the B-2 and other similar designs are essentially just a single broad but very short wing, which also gives it the added bonus of looking like something you'd expect Batman to fly over the skies of Gotham City. But there's an actual tactical reasoning behind this particular design choice. Around the mid-70s, designers for military aircraft had developed new methods for building their planes in such a way that meant that they could avoid detection from enemy interceptor craft, and in some cases even missiles. When you hear the word stealth, sci-fi might make you think of cloaking devices that reflect light away from a vessel in order to make it invisible to the naked eye. Or perhaps, if you're a little more knowledgeable when it comes to military engineering, the word might bring to mind vehicles that can avoid being picked up by radar. When people say stealth in this context, what they really mean is what's called low observable technology. In other words, exactly what a lot of those earlier stealth planes needed in order to become not invisible but more unnoticeable. The idea was to build an aircraft with an airframe, the mechanical structure of the plane, that could absorb radar signals or deflect them in a different direction so that less of the signal was bounced back toward the radar unit, leading to the craft being detected. If a plane's able to fly without appearing on radar, it can get pretty close to strategic targets while avoiding being shot down, at least by weapons that require radar to guide them to their targets. Of course, this doesn't mean that stealth planes, or other stealth vehicles for that matter, are invisible. Observing them with the human eye is still a surefire way to spot them, as well as other detection methods like infrared scanners or acoustic locators. However, most stealth craft were capable of flying without detection or being tracked, especially at night. But of course, the technology for detecting stealth planes started to improve, so in retaliation, new aircraft would be needed. After all, during the time that the B-2 was about to start being designed and created, the Cold War between the United States and USSR was very much in full swing, and of course the ongoing development of fearsome new weapons by both the Americans and the Soviets brought with it the looming threat of nuclear war. The US had to consider the very real possibility of engaging in a nuclear conflict with their enemies. But if you think dropping a nuclear weapon on someone is something you can do without being detected, then you might have been playing too much Fallout. But what if a stealth bomber could be the one carrying that nuclear payload? It'd certainly make it easier to get close enough to an enemy target without being spotted, then drop a thermonuclear gravity bomb as opposed to launching a big missile. And thanks to that stealth bomber not showing up on radar, the enemy likely wouldn't notice until it was too late. That was what the B-2 Spirit was primarily designed for. Developed during Jimmy Carter's administration, the project to create an Advanced Technology Bomber, or ATB, went underway in the 80s. This was around the time that Noshir Gawadia was working for the Northrop Grumman Corporation. Fun fact on Northrop too, in 1979 they had a classified technology demonstration aircraft called the Tacit Blue being developed at Area 51, of all places. Yes, that Area 51. Some of the stealth plane technology that was developed during this time was partially thanks to the work of Noshir Gawadia, and would also later be incorporated into the designs of other operational aircraft, including the B-2 Spirit. The initial goal in creating a B-2 stealth bomber was to give it the necessary characteristics needed to breach the Soviet Union's air defenses, which by this point had become sophisticated enough to detect and shoot down a number of earlier bombers. So in order to avoid being caught by Soviet radar signals used in detection, the B-2 would actually redirect the incoming radar energy, effectively sending it away from itself and quite literally flying under the radar. How exactly? Well, this came down to its overall design. The B-2 bomber incorporates a lot of large and complex curved shapes over its surface in order to allow it to stay undetected. This unique shape and structure meant that the Spirit couldn't be fitted with the typical vertical fins that stabilized winged aircraft, instead relying on flaps that trailed the edge of its notched wing in order to aid its direction in controlled rolls and turns. Northrop's engineers also developed a radar-absorbent coating known as alternate high-frequency material. This wouldn't be added to the B-2 until quite some time later, but spraying on the coatings of this stuff seriously cuts down on maintenance time and allows B-2s to retain their stealthy radar-avoiding characteristics. So where does Noshir Gawadia come into all this? What exactly was his contribution to the design of the B-2? Did he draw up schematics to make the aircraft stealthier, or did he just insist that the cockpit have a cup holder? Unfortunately, we haven't found any leaked top-secret documents to confirm our cup holder theory. What we do know is that Gawadia was in part responsible for making the B-2 harder to detect. Primarily, though, he was the man who got this enormous bomber to actually fly. Armed with clearance to help develop this top-secret technology, the trust given to Gawadia would inevitably prove misplaced. You see, the B-2s were actually pretty huge. In fact, let's talk stats. Each of the 20 operational B-2 bombers and the additional experimental one, all produced by Northrop, measuring at almost 70 feet long, standing 17 feet tall with a wingspan of 172 feet. Or in even more patriotic units, that's around half the length of an average football field. Anything but the metric system. On top of that, the B-2 had to carry some 40,000 pounds of ordnance, either up to 80 Mark 82 JDAM GPS-guided bombs, which weighed in at 500 pounds each, or a maximum of 16 B-83 nuclear bombs, each one a hefty 2,400 pounds. When you add the sheer size and weight of the aircraft itself to the massive amount of boom it was packing, needless to say the B-2 would be in need of some serious engine power in order to not only get airborne and stay flying, but to also do so without risking detection. You might think some big afterburners would get the job done, but these produce infrared emissions, meaning that any aircraft propelled by them will likely be picked up on infrared scanners, or worse, infrared-guided missiles. If you're flying a craft with big afterburners and a huge nuclear payload, you're going to want to avoid having your plane shot down after all. But afterburners are often prime targets for surface-to-air heat-seeking missiles. Come on, afterburners. It's literally in the name that the engines like these produce tons and tons of heat. When it comes to finding a way to make the B-2 avoid the potential drawbacks of afterburners, Noshir Gawadia came up with an out-of-the-box idea for the bomber's propulsion system. The Spirit would be powered by 4 turbofan engines, as opposed to afterburners. Turbofans are a more advanced form of turbojet engines, which function by sucking air inward and compressing it. The compressed air is then used in a combustion process by combining with the aircraft's fuel. Turbofan engines consist of large fans that work along the same principle, except only part of the air they draw in is used for combustion. The rest is released as exhaust. Overall, they're not as noisy as turbojets, as well as being more powerful, making them ideal for propelling an incredibly heavy bomber that needs to remain hidden. While it wouldn't be capable of supersonic flight thanks to its lack of afterburners, Gawadia's work ensured that the B-2 would have a far greater radius for combat, able to fly further and to reach enemy targets before using up all the fuel it would need for the return flight back to base. Gawadia also made some additional design contributions to the B-2, including its secret rear section, which featured ports that he specifically designed to cool down the exhaust coming from the turbofans. The propulsion system Gawadia conceptualized, designed, and then helped develop would be installed within the B-2 itself, rather than being situated on the aircraft exterior. Owing to his contributions to the B-2 propulsion system, Gawadia credited himself as being the, quote, father of the technology that protects the B-2 stealth bomber from heat-seeking missiles. That sure is a lot of credit for him to graciously award himself, but it's perhaps not entirely unwarranted, given the 4 turbofans would make it next to impossible to detect the B-2, at least solely via the use of infrared detection systems. However, it also likely contributed to the planes being ludicrously expensive. The considerable costs behind developing and operating the B-2 Spirit garnered the advanced technology bomber its own share of controversy among the members of the U.S. Congress at the time. On average, the development, engineering, testing, and eventual production of the B-2 cost around $2.13 billion US. If you factor in inflation, that would be just over $4 billion today. Building each of the craft cost almost $740 million, along with an average of just a little under $930 million per plane in total procurement costs. That's everything from spare parts, providing onboard equipment, and retrofitting each plane. In short, the B-2 is one of the most expensive aircraft in the entire world. Whilst the original plan was to produce 132 B-2 stealth bombers, delays hindered the project, as well as causing things to get even pricier. Add to that the fact that by the 90s, the Cold War that the B-2s were being built for was already winding down. The need for a stealth aircraft specifically designed to conduct airstrikes and even nuclear bombings deep in Soviet-controlled territory was fading. And once the Soviet Union formally dissolved, United States lawmakers saw little need for so many of those expensive planes. Ultimately, over the late 80s and early 90s, the purchase of B-2s by the United States Air Force from the Northrop Grumman Corporation was shrunk, dropping from the planned 132 to only 21, 1 experimental unit, and 20 operational bombers. Their chief role was also changed. The B-2s would still be capable of nuclear strikes, but would be used for more conventional weapons delivery. Despite no longer being needed for the purpose they'd originally been designed for, the US had a handful of these bombers now. And in true American fashion, having them also meant they flaunted them. After all, the capabilities of the B-2 Spirit bombers certainly weren't anything to be sniffed at. They could perform attack runs from altitudes as high as 50,000 feet. For comparison, commercial airliners tend to only fly an average between 30,000 and 40,000 feet. B-2s can travel more than 6,000 nautical miles at a time, even reaching up to 10,000 if they're refueled mid-flight. That's right, these bad boys can not only carry enough explosives to wipe out a small country, but they can also have their fuel tanks topped up while they're still flying. This allows these bombers to reach practically anywhere in the world within a matter of mere hours. The B-2 Spirit stealth bombers entered into active service the year 1997, around a decade after Northrop Grumman had begun producing the newly designed aircraft. As recently as 2015, the 20 operational B-2s were still in active service within the United States Air Force, with plans to continue operating them until as late as the year 2032, when they're set to be replaced by the more advanced B-21 Raider, also designed and built by our old pals Northrop Grumman. As for the B-2's effectiveness in combat, the stealth bomber would get a chance to show off exactly what it could do not long after being entered into service. From 1989 onwards, the then president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, was enacting a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Albanians from Kosovo, a small landlocked country in Southeast Europe, right in the center of the Balkans. By the time of 1995, the violence between Serbian forces and Kosovar Albanians had resulted in the loss of 250,000 innocent lives. Warnings from the United Nations Security Council suggested that this was leading to an impending humanitarian crisis. And when a UN team traveled to Kosovo to observe the situation directly, they witnessed Serbian forces attacking unarmed civilians. Peace negotiations were held in 1999 and saw more of their forces, loyal to Slobodan Milosevic, amassing on the border between Serbia and Kosovo. And when the Serbian president ultimately rejected all proposals for a peaceful solution, he sent 40,000 troops to Kosovo, leading to a refugee crisis. In response, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO, launched what it had called Operation Allied Force. The goal was to force Milosevic to withdraw his troops from Kosovo, but NATO leaders had opposed the use of ground troops to achieve their goal. Instead, this was all about air superiority. 6 B-2 stealth bombers were among the massive number of planes that were ordered to launch attacks against various targets. The three-phase plan of Operation Allied Force was to first strike at Serbian air defense systems, then their military installations that lay on both the north and south of the Kosovo border, including airstrikes that would target the Serbian capital city of Belgrade. This was the first ever combat deployment of the B-2 stealth bomber, and it certainly wasn't a slouch. They were flown nonstop for 31 hours all the way from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri over to Kosovo, only to fly all the way back after carrying out their attacks. Despite only being involved in 1% of the strikes that took place within the first 8 weeks of Operation Allied Force, B-2 bombers were responsible for destroying 33% of all Serbian ground targets. That would be far from the only thing on the list of accolades that the B-2 has achieved during the course of its operational history. It also holds the record for the longest aerial combat mission of all time. In 2001, 6 B-2 Spirits were sent to Afghanistan to support Operation Enduring Freedom, the name given to the first stage in the war in Afghanistan, part of the United States government's larger war on terror. B-2 stealth bombers were among the first American aircraft to enter Afghanistan airspace, breaking a world record in the process. Once again setting off from Whiteman Air Force Base, the bombers flew for 44 hours, making it all the way to Afghanistan with only a 45-minute pit stop in between, during which the planes were serviced and the active crews were switched out. Apparently, the entire time this was happening, their engines didn't even stop running. Once they had successfully carried out their airstrikes on the targets in Afghanistan, the B-2s would once again make the round trip all the way back to Missouri, taking 30 hours. This meant that the entire mission lasted for almost 70 consecutive hours, with the Spirit staying airborne for almost the entire time. The B-2's record, while impressive, has hardly been a perfect one. In 2008, one of the Spirit bombers, referred to as the Spirit of Kansas, crashed on a runway only a few moments after taking off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. This was the first operational loss of a B-2 bomber, but as of 2024, it remains the only time that one has ever been lost. Still, that's not so bad, right? One crash since the 90s. Wait, that one crash cost how much? Estimated to have run up a bill of almost $1.5 billion US, the Andersen-based B-2 accident is considered the most expensive aircraft crash in history. As for the cause of the incident, the plane was wet. No, seriously, an investigation launched into the crash determined that heavy rains had led to moisture making its way into the plane's air data sensors. These provide the pilot and the crew with crucial info while they're in the air, including helping them calculate airspeed and altitude. Condensation within the plane's instruments meant that the onboard computers miscalculated the correct airspeed and the angle of attack, causing the flight control system to essentially switch to a different setting the moment the wheels left the runway. The result? One big crash and a lot of mess to clean up. Luckily, though, there were no fatalities. Only 2 crew members were aboard the Spirit of Kansas B-2 when it crashed, and while they were injured, they managed to survive far more intact than the bomber itself. Of course, the examination into the cause of an accidental crash isn't the only investigation that would occur linked to the B-2 bomber. more specifically, into the activities of one of its core designers, Noshir Gawadia. While his work for the Northrop Grumman Corporation had quite literally put the B-2 in the air and kept it from drawing the attention of heat-seeking missiles, by the time the plans were complete, Gawadia had already departed from the company. After spending 20 years working for one of the United States' top defense contractors, Gawadia left in the late 80s. He would set up his own consultancy company, NS Gawadia Incorporated, in 1999, but for the most part he was free to relax in his multi-million-dollar house in Hawaii, his time designing stealth aircraft at an end. Or was it? In October 2005, Gawadia received quite an unexpected house call. Answering the knocks on his door, he no doubt would have been shocked to see federal agents standing on his porch demanding to search the premises. Overall, they searched his residence twice before Noshir Gawadia was arrested on the 26th of October and charged with providing top-secret defense information to unauthorized parties. And a lot of that secret information was related to the B-2 stealth bomber. If he hadn't already been feeling anxious before, Gawadia certainly was now. After all, he hadn't been expecting to get caught. You see, when Gawadia left his position at Northrop and started his own consulting company, he did so with the intention of making a lot of money. His reasoning was, while working at Northrop Grumman, he had been working for a salary, but by selling his expertise to the highest bidder, he'd be able to pocket any profits he garnered consulting, especially by doing business at NS Gawadia Inc., a company literally named after himself, and one that he could use to market himself as the father of the technology that protects the B-2 stealth bomber from heat-seeking missiles. Remember that one? Oh, it wasn't just Gawadia patting himself on the back, that was how he marketed himself. Working as a consultant, he began teaching classes and providing what he referred to as research and development, engineering services, technical consulting, and any business related thereto. What that actually meant was he was traveling abroad to share the secret information he picked up from his time at Northrop Grumman and, in return, receiving a nice chunk of change. Although not quite enough. His company only brought in gross receipts of around $750,000. Oh, to be able to call a sum like that not enough. But in actuality, it wasn't. Remember that multi-million-dollar mansion in Hawaii that Gawadia lived at? Well, during the early years of his consultancy company, he was trying to buy the land on the island of Maui needed to build the almost 7,000 square foot house. A house later valued at just over $1.6 million US. Add a mortgage on top, and the luxury home was starting to look pretty pricey. Then in 2002, Gawadia sent a fax. Remember those? To representatives of at least 3 foreign governments. The fax in question contained a top-secret United States Air Force document detailing the technology that he'd developed for the B-2 bomber. Specifically, it disclosed how the Spirit was able to prevent detection by infrared. But those weren't the only secrets he decided to spill. There were plenty more, some that had a direct impact on the military technology of other countries. Between the years of 2003 and 2005, Noshir Gawadia would make a number of trips to Chengdu in China, 6 in total. Why there? Well, how about 2 reasons? For one, Chengdu was home to the Chengdu Aircraft Industry Group, as well as being the location of the company that developed China's very own stealth plane, the Chengdu J-20 stealth fighter. It's widely believed that during his time in China, Gawadia used his expertise as well as top-secret information to directly contribute to the design and development of a Chinese cruise missile. He was thought to have provided details that would have even made the weapons more effective against the other American air-to-air missiles. Gawadia even went as far as to try to cover his tracks by asking border agents not to put immigration stamps in his passport when he visited China. During this same time frame, he's also thought to have sold classified stealth technology information to the government of Switzerland and to various businesses based in Israel and Germany. Gawadia also provided even more classified information that he'd had access to while he was working for Northrop to individuals attending a course he was teaching. The course focused on low observable technology, and remember, that's military engineering lingo for stealth. All that's known about the people present is that they were from another unspecified country. This country and the identity of the individuals that attended Gawadia's course have never been publicly revealed. Also, back in 2002, Gawadia sent another fax. He should have really stopped using that fax machine of his, containing a proposal for another unspecified foreign country. This contained plans for infrared suppression technology to be installed in military aircraft, similar to the stealth technology Gawadia had helped develop for the B-2 bomber. This fax was also said to have included a classified document that specifically mentioned some of the United States' own defense systems. Upon his arrest, Noshir Gawadia was charged with a single count of willfully communicating national defense information to a party that wasn't permitted to receive it. Under federal law, that's considered an act of espionage. More than just being illegal, it's treasonous. When his Hawaii mansion was searched, federal officers uncovered numerous classified documents, illegal keepsakes from Gawadia's days working for the Northrop Grumman Corporation. When put on the spot, Gawadia admitted to his crimes, confessing that he had knowingly shared classified information, not only verbally and by sharing documents, but also through presentations at the courses he'd taught, as well as sending secret information in letters and through any other methods you might imagine. Arguably even worse was his reasoning. It was also he could establish a sense of credibility with the potential customers of his consultancy company, so he could secure future business and as a result net himself more money. On top of the dissemination of classified defense information, Gawadia was also slapped with charges relating to his assistance in designing stealth technology for those Chinese cruise missiles, as well as money laundering and tax evasion also added on to the pile. Much like the development of the B-2 that had granted him access to the secrets he stole and sold, Gawadia's trial was subject to numerous delays. While it was initially scheduled for July of 2007, it had to be postponed until February the following year. Initially, this was so that Gawadia's legal counsel could be subjected to a rigorous background check. Given the highly sensitive nature of the classified secrets he'd been sharing, in order for them to be submitted as evidence, the Department of Justice had to scrupulously investigate everyone who'd be partaking in the trial. Then the trial was delayed even further, in large part thanks to Gawadia proving uncooperative when it came to actually working with his lawyers, causing assessments to be made into his mental well-being and fitness to stand trial. In 2009, his defense tried to argue that Gawadia suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. However, this was dismissed by U.S. Magistrate Judge Kevin S.C. Chang, who said that Gawadia's unwillingness to work with his defense lawyers didn't mean he was incapable of doing so. If anything, Gawadia was just trying to delay the inevitable. The trial took place eventually in 2010, with opening statements given on the 12th of April, followed by nearly 4 whole months of testimony, concluding on the 29th of July. Then the jury spent 5 days deliberating before eventually reaching a guilty verdict on the 10th of August that year. In January 2011, Gawadia received his sentence. While he could have landed in prison for the rest of his life, he instead faced 32 years behind bars. Noshir Gawadia is scheduled for release in February 2032. In an ironic twist of fate, that also happens to be the exact same year that the B-2 stealth bomber is set to be replaced and retired from active service. The plane that he helped get in the air will be flying no more by the time Gawadia is released. But the story doesn't quite end there. Thanks to the secret information that Gawadia sold to foreign governments and his involvement with China, it's long been suspected that he either directly contributed to, or at least indirectly helped start, the development of 3 other stealth plane projects that are currently being worked on by the Chinese military. The first of these is a heavily modified variant of the J-11B, an advanced twin-engine multi-purpose fighter jet built by the Shenyang Aircraft Corporation. This newer, modified stealth version, the Shenyang J-16 Silent Flanker, not only features stealth capabilities like those Gawadia helped develop for the B-2, but also comes equipped with internal weapons bays, engine intakes that are optimized for undetected flight, as well as canted vertical fins. Then there's the mighty Dragon, and no, not those ones from legends or folklore. The Chengdu J-20, as mentioned earlier, happened to emerge from the same city Gawadia was reported to have made several trips to. Developed by the Chengdu Aerospace Corporation, the J-20 is intended for use by the People's Liberation Army Air Force. It's capable of carrying out precision strikes using long-range air-to-air missiles. The J-20 lacks any kind of internal autocannons or rotary cannons, but this is because it was designed to be an air superiority fighter, making precise, devastating attacks without getting into short-range dogfights with other aircraft. When the Chengdu J-20 entered active service in March 2017, it made China the second country in the world, and the first in all of Asia, to have a stealth aircraft in operation. As for bombers, China was developing the Xi'an H-8, a prototype stealth bomber said to house between 4 and 6 large engines under its wings. The H-8 would have served as a tactical, stealth, and heavy bomber, all rolled into one aircraft. However, this project was said to have been abandoned back in the 70s.
You've earned a reputation as one of the most feared criminals in your prison, and the guards have taken notice. No punishment could break you, and you were soon back in the yard causing mayhem. But that's about to change. because now you find yourself shackled on a prison bus, surrounded by guards and other prisoners with the same threat level as you. Your new home is going to be ready for you, because it's a prison designed for the most dangerous inmates in the entire correction system. You're headed for the place where inmates who can't be handled by minimum security, medium security, or even regular maximum security are held. You're headed for Supermax. You didn't get to where you are by going in unprepared, so you did all the research you could before your transfer. You haven't been intimidated by any prison before, and you're not going to start now. But Supermax is testing that. For one thing, it doesn't seem like you'll be able to rule over the yard like you used to. Supermax prisons are designed to provide long-term segregated housing for the worst of the worst, and those who head to Supermax usually don't leave. Some are going to be there for decades, but most inmates sent to Supermax are serving life sentences, one way or another. Almost every Supermax prison has a death row attached, unless it's in a state that doesn't have the death penalty. A Supermax prison has several key characteristics beyond being for long-term sentences. Their administration is powerful and has wide latitude to keep the inmates under control. That includes punishment without the opportunity for appeal or outside overview. Activities are limited compared to other prison types, with few opportunities for recreation, college classes, or support groups like you might find in other prisons. Guess you'll have to wait for your next prison to pursue that law degree. It's extremely rare for an inmate to be sentenced to Supermax at trial unless they're considered a pressing security risk to the public. Most inmates are sent after extensive trouble at other prisons. You consider it a badge of honor. But the thing that worries you the most about Supermax? Boredom. At your old prison, you kept busy. You were a regular fixture in the yard, working out and getting ripped. All the better to intimidate your fellow inmates and scrap with the guards. But at Supermax, security is much tighter. When you arrive, you are thoroughly searched. You're immediately taken to your cell. No cellmates to cook up schemes with here. Your cell is segregated, and you'll stay in it for 23 hours of the day. You got a toilet and some limited entertainment options, including approved books. Some jurisdictions offer a TV for inmates who stay on their best behavior, something that's never easy for you. You'll even be taking meals in your cell, delivered through a slot in the door. They're not taking any chances. It's a shame. Your favorite part of lunchtime was getting an extra dessert from some unfortunate new fish seated next to you. But what about that one extra hour a day? Finally, some recreation. You're let out into the yard and you're looking forward to stretching your legs, but good luck with that. Even when you're exercising, you're in a cage. Recreation time is spent in small, secure spaces, and inmates are either let out alone or with one other inmate, and the guards are always close by to make sure no one makes contact. You'll have to get used to being watched at all times. One of the most consistent parts of being in Supermax is that surveillance is everywhere. Closed-circuit cameras are pointed in every cell, and when an inmate is out of their cell, you can bet there'll be several guards right by to take them down should they try anything. You remember at your old prison when you were on work detail and you snuck off and hitchhiked to the next county. It doesn't look like you'll be pulling a repeat performance here. You won't have a roommate, but you can't help but wonder who's sharing this prison with you. You know it's the worst of the worst, and many of them have lengthy rap sheets like you. You got here one crime and fight at a time, but many of your fellow inmates got here a lot faster. High-security prisoners are often transferred to Supermax immediately, especially if the government's worried about someone trying to break them out pre-trial or after sentencing. If an inmate has ties to foreign radical groups or is a high-level drug dealer, they're likely to be sent here out of caution. You don't know if they're in this very prison, but notorious criminals ripped from the headlines, like the drug kingpin El Chapo or Russian spy Robert Hansen, are serving life sentences in Supermax. But you're not intimidated. You know you'll get an opportunity to get the drop on a guard, and you'll show everyone in here who's boss. After all, what's the worst they can do to you? You're already in Supermax. Well, the sight of another inmate yelling as they drag him down the hall might give you a clue. The rules in Supermax are enforced strictly, and there's usually only one punishment for breaking them: solitary confinement. But you're already in solitary confinement in your cell, right? Not quite. At Supermax, when you get sent to solitary, you're going to the hole. This windowless, featureless cell is very different from the one you're used to, and it's easy to lose track of time in there. If that's what awaits you, maybe picking a fight at the first opportunity isn't the best idea. At least there's some things to look forward to around here, including mealtime. You're not getting fine dining, that's for sure, but there's a pretty steady parade of decent fare, not that different from when you were in school. Ah, good old school days, intimidating the lunch lady for an extra portion of fries. For lunch, you might have scrambled eggs, a chicken sandwich, or tacos. For dinner, it's usually heartier fare like meatloaf, pasta marinara, or roast beef. There will also be a vegetarian option, and prisons work to accommodate special diets like allergies and religious needs. There goes that plan to escape by getting taken to the hospital with an allergic reaction. But if you're not satisfied with the meals, you've got one other option: the prison commissary. This is like a 7-Eleven at Supermax. If you've got someone on the outside willing to put money into your account, you can purchase anything you want from the shelves and have it brought to your cell. Treats include instant ramen, dried fruit, packaged taco fixins, and popular snacks from the outside world. Not exactly fine dining, but it's a taste of home that you're in dire need of. Just make sure you manage your money wisely. It's not like you can earn more through work detail like you did at your old prison. It doesn't take long and you're starting to go stir crazy. Your thoughts once again turn to escape. After all, how hard could it be? You haven't met a prison yet that could break you. Well, you might want to rethink that. Not only are those security cameras watching you at all times, but if you manage to get outside, you'll be up against the guard towers. You'll find yourself in a wide open space with nothing blocking the view from the armed guards above. There's a reason Supermax prisons are usually in isolated locations, not crowded urban centers. The fewer places there are to hide, the harder it is for you to get away. When a Supermax prisoner manages to escape, which happens rarely, the guards will try to capture them. But if they get far enough that it's only the guard towers between them and escape, well, they're not coming back to their cell one way or another. At least you're not as isolated as the people in the very first Supermax prison. They were taken by ferry to one of the most notorious sites in prison history, the famous Alcatraz Island, where freezing shark-infested water stood between them and escape. Alcatraz was considered a prototype for the Supermax facility when it was founded as a federal prison in 1934. The far-off location in San Francisco Bay made up for the lack of modern security, and it was very successful at keeping people on the island. There were 14 escape attempts over the years, with 23 being caught alive, 6 being shot while escaping, 2 drowning, and 5 never being found. Authorities believe these 5 men drowned and their bodies were lost, but many believe they escaped. The only prisoner to ever get off Alcatraz Island was John Paul Scott, who successfully swam all the way to shore, only to collapse from exhaustion on the beach and be quickly apprehended. Supermax prisons aren't on islands anymore because the government uses state-of-the-art technology to make sure prisoners are secure. For these federal inmates who the government wants to keep under lock and key, there's only one destination: ADX Florence in Fremont County, Colorado. Often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, it's home to virtually all of the country's most notorious federal prisoners, including foreign and domestic attackers, spies, organized crime bosses, cult leaders, and drug kingpins. Almost all are doing sentences of 20 years or more, with most doing life or awaiting execution. But there are over 50 prisons with Supermax facilities around the United States, most holding prisoners of different security levels. Supermax facilities in standard prisons are known as SHUs, or segregated housing units, and the prisoners in these units never interact with the lower security prisoners sharing the facility. Being here is gonna be pretty boring, and you're not optimistic about escaping, so it's time you find out how you're gonna keep yourself occupied. Well, they're obviously not going to let you wander around the prison, and exercise is strictly regulated. Amenities vary by prison, but most offer a library. Inmates make requests for books from the prison library and they're delivered to your cell, almost like a bookmobile. You don't think they'll give you books about how to tunnel out of your cell, so maybe it's time to catch up on some of those great American novels you didn't read in high school. Computer access is strictly limited and monitored, but some Supermax prisons allow for their use. It's even possible in some Supermax prisons to take remote college classes, with coursework being delivered remotely via mail. One thing's for sure: however you keep yourself busy in your new home, you'd better get used to doing it alone. The one thing you're not going to get in your new digs is socializing time. The good news is, there's one way you might be getting out of here sooner than the judge wants. Supermax prisons are coming under increasing fire from civil rights activists who say they amount to cruel and unusual punishment. The United Nations has condemned the way they're run, and a federal lawsuit against ADX Florence was filed in 2012 claiming chronic abuse and neglect. The suit was dismissed, but a campaign to abolish them continues. Adding to that momentum, they're extremely expensive to run. ADX Florence cost over $60 million to build in 1994, and the costs keep rising. Outfitting a Supermax can cost up to 3 times as much as a regular maximum security block, and many people question if it's money well spent. No one's looking to transfer El Chapo into general population, but advocates say many inmates could be better rehabilitated in a more integrated environment. If you want to survive Supermax, you'll need a few things. You'll need to be able to handle isolation. You'll want to take advantage of every opportunity you have for entertainment and comfort. Reading, taking enrichment courses, getting special snacks from the commissary. Even if they're not exactly your cup of tea, your options are limited. You'll need to get your exercise in close quarters and stay off the guard's radar. Most of all, you'll need patience and maybe to sign some of those petitions to abolish Supermax prisons. At the time of writing, there are 2,738 inmates on death row in the United States. This number can change quite frequently, given that some prisoners, of course, might be executed, but others might have their sentence commuted. They might have their sentence overturned, or someone else might join them on death row. Right now, only 2% of people on death row are women. 42% of people are classified as white, 41% black, 13% Latino, 1.9% Asian, 1% Native American, and the rest is stated as unknown. You can be on death row for a long, long time. And believe it or not, the average time spent there from sentencing to the day in the execution chamber is 20 years. Let's now see what happens on that final day, 8 p.m. The inmate is taken from death row to another cell. This involves a drive from the prison to what one former official in a documentary called the death house. That official said prior to leaving death row and getting in the van to come to the death house, the inmate will be searched really well. He said this wasn't only because a weapon might harm a guard, but mainly because they don't want the prisoner committing suicide. Another guard interviewed said he once took a route to the death house where they couldn't be ambushed. Tensions are high during these events. He also said the atmosphere in the van was solemn. We all knew where we were going and why. Nobody said a whole lot. Once the prisoner goes into the death house, he won't ever see the light of day again, unless some kind of appeal works for him. 9 p.m. After booking in, he can sleep until he's awakened, if indeed he can sleep. We managed to find the diary of one prisoner who described his move to his new cell. They stripped me out with a female officer present, he wrote. Now, personally, I'm not the shy type, but having a female officer on death watch is just one more humiliation. We're told that during this time, the prisoner is on something called death watch. He's watched all the time in case he tries to take his own life. The cell is close to the execution chamber and it is very private, a space where the inmate can reflect on life as the hours count down. This might happen just one day before, but we found cases where it was a couple of days. Prisoners will also be given special clothes in most cases, much smarter than prison attire. The man who kept the diary wrote he was happy to have at last a pair of trousers with a button and zip. We don't know how well he slept, but in his diary he comments about watching the guards sleep. This is what he wrote. Good for them. I'm sure this has to be stressful for them. So a moment's relaxation is well earned. I also enjoy the irony. Who exactly is watching whom? One other thing he says is that the death house is much cleaner than his death row cell. He remarks that there's not a bug in sight, whereas in his last cell it was like going on safari. 4:30 a.m. The inmate is woken up bright and early in his cell. We should add here times might change from place to place. Petitions might still be pending, and there's a phone right outside the cell. In the cell, there's a shower, a toilet, a bed, and a desk. During this last day, the prisoner is allowed to see family and can be visited by a chaplain. As for calling people, the inmate can write down a list of phone numbers he intends to call and give that to the guards. One guard interviewed said we would dial the number for him and then allow him to make his call. But after the prisoner has called the last person on his list, the only person he'll have to talk to is the chaplain. We're told that after this last call, it can be a very traumatic time. One chaplain interviewed said I was to do everything and anything to help him face that last day, whatever it was, writing letters, making phone calls, singing songs, listening, and listening. 8 a.m. We said they can have visitors, but 8 a.m. is the cutoff time. After that, the prisoner is on his own, besides having prison staff around and, of course, anyone involved in his case should something change. The chaplain can still visit too. At around this time, in the actual death chamber, it's very likely that the equipment will be tested. This might mean checking that the straps on the gurney work, or even checking the phone to the governor's office is working. Yep, imagine it wasn't and there was a last-minute reprieve. If the form of execution is the chair, then its electrical components have to be tested. In one case we found, the actual governor was the person who they strapped in to test if he could get out or move out of the straps. I didn't want my staff to get kicked in the face, he remarked. 10:30 a.m. Now it's lunchtime. Yes, this is an early lunch, but let's not forget the inmate has been up a long time already. Lunch is not special, it's not the last meal. From what we can see, it's the same old prison food. The only difference is that the prisoner gets to eat it in a private setting. The inmate we talked about before said what he got for lunch was orange juice and what he called a prison-issue donut. For quite a few hours now, the prisoner has a lot of time to think, and as you know, they have a desk and can write any number of letters, goodbyes, or just reflect on life. 3 p.m. If the inmate is to get the electric chair, he'll have his head shaved around this time. But this might also happen later in the day. He might still talk to a spiritual advisor, but food might also be on his mind right now. Around this time, maybe an hour or so later, the inmate will also be asked to dress in one of those smart clothes he's been given. He'll be asked to take a shower before he does this, a shower at least in total privacy. He'll have already written down what he wants to eat, so in the kitchen the death house chef will be doing all the preparations. 4 p.m. The inmate will receive his last meal. Contrary to popular belief, inmates can't just order what they want. It makes sense because it's highly unlikely that authorities would splash out on the finest Wagyu beef. In Florida, for instance, the maximum this last meal can cost is $40, but this will change from state to state. Those poor convicts over in Oklahoma only get a limit of $15, or at least when one documentary we watched was made. That is hardly enough to go crazy on your last meal. It's still good though. As one death house chef pointed out, this meal is the only choice of food they might have had in 2 decades. In some states though, prisoners no longer get a bespoke last meal and only get the usual prison food. To give you an idea of what inmates might choose, we will list some last meals. Serial killer John Wayne Gacy had 12 fried shrimp, an entire bucket of KFC, some French fries, and a whole load of strawberries. The man behind the Oklahoma bombing, Timothy McVeigh, just opted for 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. A killer from Florida called Angel Nieves Diaz chose absolutely nothing. The terrible Ted Bundy did pretty much the opposite, ordering a steak cooked medium rare, eggs on the side, over easy, some hash browns, slices of toast, and some milk and juice. The infamous female serial killer Eileen Wuornos was good with just a cup of coffee, while a murderer called Stephen Woods must have been famished. We should add that many thought he was innocent and his last words were, "You're not about to witness an execution, you're about to witness a murder." Before that, he asked to eat, according to the website Ranker, 2 pounds of bacon, a large 4-meat pizza, 4 fried chicken breasts, 2 drinks each of Mountain Dew, Pepsi, root beer, and sweet tea, 2 pints of ice cream, 5 chicken fried steaks, 2 hamburgers with bacon, fries, and a dozen garlic breadsticks with marinara on the side. That state must have had a big budget. 5 p.m. The witnesses will likely arrive at the prison. This might be family of the victims, journalists, family of the condemned, friends of the condemned, or whoever the condemned has asked to be witnesses. They will be told to try and stay quiet when they reach the witness room. Before that, they'll wait somewhere else. In most states, civilians who didn't know anyone involved will be asked to witness the execution. 6 to 8 p.m. The time of execution can vary from state to state, but it's just about always in the early evening. At this point, the prisoner will be taken to the execution room. The witnesses will soon be in the witness room. Prisoners, for the most part, will just walk right there and not give the guards any problems. In some states, this will be a 5-man team, just in case there is a struggle. But that doesn't happen often. One warden interviewed who had done 89 executions said he'd only had one prisoner that was hard to deal with. The walk to the chamber in most places is only about 10 feet, just over 3 meters. The guys would usually walk right up to the electric chair. They weren't forced by the staff. By that point, they've already accepted what will happen. A former Death Watch guard told Business Insider. Another guard in a separate interview said the same. Inmates usually act very dignified. It's a very clean procedure, there's no hustling and bustling. It's not always this way, especially if the prisoner's protesting his innocence. In 2018, the BBC reported that one man in Florida was screaming and thrashing before he was executed, screaming to everyone that they were murdering an innocent man. One warden said the first thing that catches his eye is that gurney, which is the place he's going to die. If it is lethal injection, which it often is, the prisoner is told to sit on the gurney and then lay down. There will be a tie-down team, each responsible for a part of the prisoner's body. Doctors will usually not be at the execution because it's not in line with their code of ethics, so there will be a special team to administer the drugs. This is not always easy as the veins tend to hide during this stressful time. Some of them had burnt veins from drugs, which would make the process longer and more painful, said one former warden. When the catheters are in place, the inmate will be secured again. There's about 15 minutes before the execution. Believe it or not, some inmates have got a stay, which means a call to stop the execution. during these last minutes. If that doesn't happen, the witnesses are brought into the main room and the curtains are undrawn. Some inmates might make a final statement. It depends on the state, but some prisoners might be given a few minutes, and others just allowed to make a brief statement. Kentucky gives 2 minutes, but in Pennsylvania you can't talk at all, and the statement can only be written. Here are some fairly recent examples of last words. I'm ready to roll. Time to get this party started. My last words will be, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Somebody needs to kill my trial attorney. I think that governor's phone is broke. He hasn't called yet." These are, of course, unusual ones, and most people will just say their goodbyes to loved ones or give an apology for what they did. At this point, the chaplain might lay a hand on the prisoner, sometimes where there's a pulse. The warden will give the signal to the executioner, and then it's time. The end of the day, the end of a life. If you've already seen the 2008 movie Bronson, about Britain's so-called most notorious prisoner, don't worry. That rather theatrical piece of cinema didn't tell you much about the man, so there's so much more to see today. You might be thinking that it's coincidental that a man with such a reputation has the same name as a former Hollywood tough guy, but he wasn't called that at birth. The name was acquired during his bare-knuckle boxing days. He was actually born Michael Gordon Peterson. Yep, that doesn't sound quite as fearful. There's a lot of controversy about this man, regarding whether he should have been in prison for so long or if prison is to blame for his often crazy behavior. We discuss this and more in this episode of The Infographic Show, Britain's most notorious prisoner, Charles Bronson. As you know, he was born with the name Michael. His birth date was December 6, 1952. He spent his first few years in Wales and then moved to Luton, which isn't too far away from the capital, London. It doesn't seem that he came from a rough and tumble background, given that his father ran a conservative club for a while and his aunt and uncle were a mayor and mayoress. His aunt actually once said this about him: "As a boy, he was a lovely lad. He was obviously bright and always good with children. He was gentle and mild-mannered, never a bully. He would defend the weak." He might have defended the weak, but it seems his penchant for violence and crime started early in life. After he moved up north at the age of 13, it seems that that's when trouble started. At that age, he was charged as a juvenile for stealing, and it said he was part of a gang. He didn't much enjoy school and soon left to start working at an early age. His first job came when he moved back down to Luton. This was a very short 2-week stint working in Tesco supermarket. Apparently, he was fired for attacking his manager. After this, it seems, crime became second nature to young Michael. He got in trouble for criminal damage but got off with a fine and some probation. He had lots of jobs, mostly related to labor or factory work, and we're told he enjoyed nothing more than a good night out on the town, drinking gallons of beer and getting into fistfights with the locals. Easy to do in some areas of the UK. He likely wasn't short of foes on the mean streets of Luton. One of his jobs, we're told, was a circus strongman, so he was likely a hard man to fight. He got in trouble again after crashing a stolen lorry, or a truck, into another car, but again got off with just a fine as no one was seriously hurt. At this point, he is still in his teens. Yet again, he got into trouble, and at this time aged 19, when he was involved in a smash and grab, which is basically smashing a car into a shop front and getting as much as you can. Again, he got off with just a fine and a suspended sentence. Age 20, perhaps, he got his chance to join what is sometimes called the straight and narrow, as he met a girl and got married. But apparently, she quite liked his tough guy persona, his tailored suits, and the fact that he spoke in a Cockney accent. They had a child and called him Michael Jonathan Peterson. According to the British press, the son is very private and has never spoken publicly about his notorious dad, so we can't tell you much about him. Moving on, now 22, Michael was arrested for armed robbery, and at this time the judge came down hard. He got 7 years, but prison wasn't exactly a place he liked being, it seemed. During his first stint in prison in Liverpool, he attacked 2 other prisoners, and we're told he wasn't provoked. That got him time in solitary, something he would see much more of later. He was then transferred to prison in Hull, and again had issues with guards and prisoners. They gave him sedatives to calm him down, which apparently made him very ill. He also spent more time in isolation, and he was said to be a very difficult prisoner. On one occasion, he was out of solitary, he attacked a prisoner with a glass jug, and he was convicted of unlawful wounding. Yet again, he was moved, this time to the tough Armley Jail in Leeds, a foreboding-looking place if you've ever seen one. So there he was, now serving time in what looks like a medieval castle. Even in 2018, the place is said to be the place with the highest rate of people taking their own lives. And in the press right now, it's said it's still very much an unsafe place for both prisoners and staff. Back in the 70s, it can't have been a holiday. But it seems he was too much for Armley, and he kept moving between a number of prisons, sometimes chained to the floor of the vans he traveled in. It's said if not in solitary, he would attack prisoners and guards. It's also said he incurred numerous vicious beatings from the guards after an attack. You might have seen that in the movie, which depicts these guards having to tackle him in numbers. During one time in solitary while recovering from a beating, he got divorced. We imagine this might have been a low point, but it's said that one thing that kept him going was his solitary workout routine, keeping him healthy and fearsome. His book, Solitary Fitness, which he wrote after many years inside, has sold millions of copies. Reviews are actually very positive, although people talk about how strange the book can get at times. Profits from the book, says the media, go to children's charities. The British press tells us that his strength was quite unbelievable. He once bent the cell bars with his own hands, and it's said he holds 6 world records for strength and fitness. Another unofficial record he has set is the most prison rooftop protests by any British inmates. But right now, we're still in the 70s and a long way from fame or infamy. While in prison in London, he tried to poison an inmate, and it seems that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Enough with prison, he was transferred to a psychiatric facility. But guess who he met there? 2 of Britain's most ruthless gangsters, the Kray twins. He called them the best 2 guys I ever met. That friendship didn't last long though, as he was moved back to prison. What followed was more solitary, escape attempts, attacks on prisoners that ended with lifelong scars, more attacks, and finally, when the authorities were sick and tired, he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. He was no longer just a criminal, but mentally ill. In 1978, he was again in another special facility, but it seems he didn't much like being forced to take medication and wasn't keen on the fact that he was surrounded by some of Britain's most disturbed people. Men who would never leave the facility because they had done things to people we will not talk about. Yep, he didn't like some of these terrible men, and at one point was said to be about 5 seconds away from killing a fellow patient or prisoner who had taken the life of an innocent child. In his own words, describing the people around him at the facility, "I witnessed them running into walls, using their heads as rams. I've seen them fall unconscious doing this. There was one who just kept trying to eat himself, biting his arms, legs, and feet." He tried to kill another prisoner, and then in 1982, when still in the notorious Broadmoor, he led a rooftop protest that lasted 3 days and caused around $300,000 worth of damage. Now you can see why this guy became well known as a hard-to-deal-with prisoner. But there was a lot more to come. He hadn't even started. He led 2 more rooftop protests and also went on a hunger strike, but in some ways he found solace in writing poems, sketching, and creating cartoon strips. He even won awards for his work. It didn't stop him being violent though, just settled him down from time to time. Psychiatrists couldn't figure him out, and even though he was in a mental facility, he was never properly diagnosed. He once said, "Asylums are crazy places with crazy rules. If you're not mad when you arrive, you are when you leave." Again, he was moved from facility to prison, stabbing inmates, hitting others, more rooftop protests, more isolation, more beatings from the guards, more medicine, and perhaps his piece de resistance, he once strangled a prison governor. After that, he was not allowed out of isolation until he finished his sentence. He got out of prison in 1987 and almost immediately turned to crime. Although his first offense was quite comical, he bought a water pistol and modified it a bit, after which he forced a man at Water Pistol Point to drive him to Luton, his favorite spot. There, he started bare-knuckle fighting and earned the nickname Charles Bronson. He actually legally changed his name to this. Was this the start of a life on the outside? Not a chance. It's written that he would fight anyone and even challenged the king of bare-knuckle fighting, Lenny McLean. It seems Lenny wanted no part of him, or at least when he agreed to fight, it was too late as Bronson was back in prison. In another fight, he was challenged to go against a large Rottweiler. He killed it and said later in life that he really regretted that. It was cash in hand though. He was only out of prison months and was back inside again for armed robbery. We won't go into details, but he fought again, attacked prisoners, guards, and had more time in solitary, was moved and moved and moved, and occasionally tried to start riots. In 1989, he was attacked himself, stabbed in the back several times, but he recovered. He wouldn't tell the police anything about his attackers. In 1992, he got out for the grand total of 53 days. He was jailed but got off. Then he was arrested again for having a shotgun and conspiracy to rob. It gets crazy here, because while on the remand, he took a librarian as a hostage. While negotiating with police, he had 3 demands: an inflatable doll, a helicopter, and a cup of tea. Yep, you heard that right. He was given 8 years despite saying the gun was to blow off his own head. It wasn't the first time he had contemplated taking his own life. He was difficult again, transferred from prisons, and at times was left naked for many days on end in dark isolation. At one point, he was put in the worst spot in any prison in the UK, something called the Hannibal Cage, that had been created for another prisoner who had once killed inmates and was said to have spooned out one person's brain and eaten it. Even though at one point he attacked a governor, it's said he got much better after being allowed to interact with handicapped children. He also kept up his cartoon sketching. These were the quiet times. They didn't last long. He endured more solitary, more moves, and then in one prison he took 2 Iraqi hijackers as hostage in his cell. It's said he was going crazy after losing his father. It's also said that he told the guards if they came close he would snap off the heads of his hostages. He made his hostages tickle his feet and demanded they sing songs to him. To them he was known as the General. He demanded a plane, machine guns, ammunition, and a cheese and pickle sandwich. It seems later he just kept asking for ice cream. In the end, he let the hostages go and another 7 years were added to his sentence. While in great physical shape, it's said that all the time in darkness and solitary had negative effects on his eyes and his social skills, and lawyers now started to get on his side. It's a pity then that he took one of them hostage. He let him go quickly though, but after one civilian worker criticized his drawings, he took him hostage too, and then started ripping up parts of the prison. What else? Well, after the millennium, he got married again, converted to Islam, changed his name and took another hostage, wrote a book, sketched a lot, and then changed his name to Charles Arthur Charlie Salvador, out of respect for his favorite artist. The movie came out and he became a household name. Until then, not many people knew about him. Thousands of people around the world started to support him, saying even though he had been a bad boy, his incarceration had just gone on too long. But he couldn't stop messing up. In 2014, he attacked another governor. That same year, his artwork went up for auction, and his 200 pieces, often dark in nature, fetched around £30,000. Bronson donated a large part of this to the brain tumor charity and Keach Hospice in Luton. Bronson said the old him was now dead, and he was born again as the artist Salvador. He created more works too, donating to other charities and one-time Oxford's homeless. He also got married to an actress in 2017, and she's hoping to see him out soon. In total, out of the 44-plus years he served, 36 of them have been in solitary confinement, sometimes without light. In 2018, it was said that he is in open prison, but will have his case reviewed in 2 years and could get out. That might not happen though, as he's got a life sentence for one of his kidnappings. That was a teacher in 1999 that he held for 2 days. The British media reports that he allegedly smothered himself in butter, age 65, and challenged the guards to a fight. We'll leave you with something he once said: "I'm a nice guy, but sometimes I lose all my senses and become nasty. That doesn't make me evil, just confused." If there is one person the US authorities do not want escaping from prison, it's the notorious Mexican drug kingpin, one Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. This man, from meager beginnings, the son of a farming family from Sinaloa, became an enemy #1 of the United States, and a very rich man too. They have him locked up now, but El Chapo has escaped from prison before. Not once, but twice. So it goes without saying that right now he is guarded like no one else on the planet. Could this criminal Houdini get out again? Let's have a look. First, let's see how he managed to escape from prison the first time. In 1993, the LA Times ran the headline, "Mexico arrests reputed top drug kingpin." He was arrested in Guatemala, not far from the Mexican border. The charges against him were murder, kidnapping, and of course, drug trafficking. The authorities said he was behind a huge trafficking operation in a massive tunnel that ran from Tijuana to San Diego, where drugs were carried through. Digging tunnels, as you'll see, was something of a forte for Guzman and his crew. He was extradited to Mexico and got 20 years 9 months to be served in a maximum security prison. There, it said he controlled the place and lived in comfort, with the guards doing what he told them to do. While he could easily run his operations from there, as time went by, he feared extradition to the US. It was time to go. It was January 19, 2001 when he made the first escape. A prison guard named Francisco El Chito Cambreros Rivera opened the electronic door to his cell when Guzman hid himself in a laundry basket. He was pushed through a series of doors and eventually got out of the main door. From there, he was taken in the trunk of a car to a designated spot, and when the time was right, he took off into the night. Like that, he was gone. It might sound too easy, but it was found out that he not only had guards on his payroll, but also the prison director. Even the cops were paid to make his getaway into the night that much easier. It turned out to be a bit of an embarrassment for the Mexican authorities. All the bribes Guzman paid added up to around $2.5 million. So this could never happen again, right? Wrong. He kept on doing what he did and became Mexico's most wanted man. But despite that, he managed to evade capture. Then on the 22nd of February 2014, after an operation between Mexican and US authorities, he was captured again. They had him, and they thought that was it. He was not going to bribe his way out of prison this time. When being moved around, he was surrounded by the military and the police. Even the A-team couldn't have made the plan come together to extricate this guy from the arms of the law. This time, he was locked up in a very restricted area. His cell had no windows and he had little contact with anyone. He had a Spartan cell and this time no luxuries. A bed, a shelf, a shower, a toilet bowl, and a basin. That's what he got. He was allowed some visits and he had the right to receive the maximum amount of money to buy hygiene products. That was about $48 US. Not so much for the man who had millions. He could take an hour out of his cell a day, but the guards were told not to communicate with him. How on earth could he escape a second time then? Well, on the 11th of July 2015, he did just that. You see, there was a blind spot for the security cameras, and that was where the shower was. At close to 9 p.m. that night, he was seen going to that part of the cell, and that's where he vanished. Prior to that, for months, El Chapo's men had been digging a tunnel, and the end point was at that shower cell. The digging had been so noisy at times, some of the other inmates had complained about strange noises. El Chapo's wife, Emma Coronel, played a big part in orchestrating the escape. El Chapo had landed not far from the prison where the digging began, and he had even managed to get a smartwatch smuggled into his cell so the diggers knew the coordinates. This was some escape, and the tunnel even had ventilation and lighting. To get out fast, El Chapo used a motorbike, but it was especially made to run on rails. This contraption was also used for the excavation process. Authorities later said the tunnel was 0.93 miles long, 5 feet 7 inches high, and 30 inches in width. It was 33 feet underground, and so El Chapo used a ladder to get down there. He was a free man, but his freedom didn't last very long. After an armed raid at a residence on the 8th of January 2016, Guzman managed to get away, once again using tunnels. He was captured shortly after though. Now, the USA wanted him again, and the proceedings got in the way to extradite him. Guzman's men tried anything to prevent this from happening, and even assassinated a federal judge. It didn't work. He was finally extradited on January 9, 2017 to the USA, exactly 18 years after this first prison escape. Right after his sentencing, in which he received life in prison plus 30 years, he just disappeared. That's because on his way to prison, the safest bet was to take him to an undisclosed location. Even Guzman's lawyers didn't know where he was. It was later revealed that he ended up at what's called America's highest security prison. That is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. It's known in short as ADX Florence. This is where the worst of the worst go. In prison terms, it's the end of the road. There are way more guards here to the number of inmates than at other prisons. Inmates are locked up 23 hours a day. When they are allowed out, it may come at any time, day or night. So even if somehow a plan could be devised by the people on the outside, they wouldn't know when their guy was out of his cell. The 7 by 12 feet cell has a bed, a stool, and a desk all made of poured concrete. The cells are soundproofed so prisoners can't shout and communicate with each other. The inmates never know where they are in the facility because they never see through a window that will allow them to guess their location. Even when they can exercise, it is not a yard, but an empty swimming pool, so they can't see over the walls. It's not a big one either, and it only takes 10 steps to walk from end to end. All over the prison there are motion detectors and cameras, and the thick steel doors can only be opened with remote control. Officers monitor all parts of the prison from a control room, and if anything strange should happen, they can hit a panic button which will automatically lock every door in the prison. The prison also has pressure pads, so an alert is sent if someone should stand on one of those pads. If someone could somehow get past the pressure pads and the cameras and get outside, they would have to scale a 12-foot tall razor wire fence, and they'd have to do that in front of heavily armed guards in one of the many towers. Other guards will walk around with attack dogs. It's very likely that Guzman is also in the most secure unit of this ultra-secure prison, which is called Range 13. By the way, guards at this prison are vetted to prevent anyone corrupt getting a job. While working, they're told to communicate with the prisoners as little as possible. It's escape-proof is what most people say, and it's not a nice place to end up. A former warden once described it like this: "This Supermax is life after death. It's long-term. In my opinion, it's far much worse than death. Others have said how eerily quiet the place is because no two inmates move at the same time. It's very clean, everything is spotless, so when journalists have gone in, they've been very surprised. It might look as bright as heaven if it weren't hell. In fact, that's how one warden described it, like a clean version of hell. He told 60 Minutes, "I don't know what hell is, but I do know the assumption would be for a free person, it's pretty close to it." This is how one inmate described it. The purpose is to gradually tear a person down mentally and physically through environmental and physical deprivation. For an inmate, it's kind of like having the place to yourself. Some people have said, because it's like this, the only way a person could escape would be if they actually had the prison warden in their pocket, which is never going to happen. There are only around 400 inmates, some of whom include Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma City bomber. Just to get near the place, you'd be spotted, and Guzman can forget about buying land near it. This prison is in a remote location. There's not much for miles around. Guzman has visitors, but only his lawyer and his 2 daughters have been allowed to see him. He cannot actually touch anyone who visits him. He's told his lawyer because of the oppressive conditions, he regularly throws up, has headaches, and also sinus trouble. He said it's also very hard to sleep because the lights are on all the time. If prisoners do want to break from the monotony, they at least have a TV, but that only plays religious and educational programs. This is how another person who's retired from the prison described this place. Supermax is austere, and it's run with absolute structure and security in mind. From an operational perspective, it's the most secure prison on Earth. But if the man known as Papillon escaped from the notorious Devil's Island penal colony, and if those 3 guys really did escape from Alcatraz, maybe no prison on Earth is 100% secure. Just about anyone in the corrections business would disagree, but maybe El Chapo could get out of this one. What are the chances of Mr. Guzman escaping from the place nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies? Let's think about it. If he were to get out of his cell, maybe he'd have to do that by bribing a guard. But they've been vetted. Perhaps the only way a guard would offer him help would be because Guzman's men had kidnapped his family. But as only one man moves at a time, that prisoner is being watched from the control room. We just don't think he could go out the front door. He certainly couldn't get past those pressure pads, and the guards in the towers, and the guards with the dogs, and over a massive fence that would cut him to pieces. All the time, everything is caught on CCTV. He would need a small army on the outside, and since the location is in the middle of nowhere, that army would be seen. Even if he employed some great hacker to hack the prison system and open the doors, he'd still have to face heavily armed guards. We can't see this happening outside of a Hollywood movie. But prisoners do have rights to see medical professionals, never mind how secure they are. This is the US law, so perhaps an escape could be made if El Chapo had to make a trip to a hospital. Possibly a catastrophic event, such as an earthquake or a fire, could result in an escape. But this is pretty unlikely. If prisoners were suddenly removed from their cells, they'd be shackled, so they wouldn't get anywhere fast. In conclusion, we think El Chapo will not be going anywhere. This prison is a techno fortress that no man could escape from. The only scenario that he gets out in is a screenplay which involves an apocalyptic event shutting down all the systems and the guards being eaten by monsters, after which El Chapo sneaks out the back door and begins a mission of survival. He'll be doing no digging out of prison this time, and no one will be holding out their hand and accepting a bribe. It's August 11th, 1934, and along with 136 prisoners, you're on your way to what will become known as America's toughest prison. You guys are what the authorities have called the incorrigibles, because in the prisons where you've come from, you just couldn't stop causing trouble. All of you have been called violent and unpredictable, and so you're being taken to the penitentiary version of hell. You sit there on a specially designed train coach, handcuffed and surrounded by 60 FBI agents, US Marshals, and other security. The atmosphere is solemn, and each of you grisly-looking hardened criminals each eye each other with distrust. Every chug of the train is foreboding. In your mind, it says to you, "You're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell." You're not wrong. That's how the first shipment of prisoners traveled to Alcatraz Island. None of those guys were prisoner number 1, since Alcatraz had some leftover army prisoners. This place has been a military prison before it became the penitentiary renowned as being an inescapable hellhole. Let's just pretend you were one of these prisoners again. You arrive on that train in a place called Tiburon at 9:40 a.m. A barge is waiting in the water there, and that's how you'll get to the island located in San Francisco Bay. The train carriage where you've been sitting could perhaps go down as one of the most well-guarded trains in the history of rail. Imagine if some of the USA's most violent prisoners all got loose, something akin to a movie about the Wild West. No one escapes this day. Many of the men around you are convicted killers, and others are notorious bank robbers. You can make a book out of your combined rap sheets. Each of these guys have been called an agitator, and the authorities have noted that the men are desperate. Most of them have planned prison escapes from other places, and it's well known that they will kill anyone who gets in the way of their freedom. For that reason, you'll be guarded by highly trained men, and when we say highly trained, we don't mean in rehabilitation. They are men that were chosen for their toughness, not their ability to help improve prisoners' behavior. The two men in charge, the warden and his assistant, have been nicknamed the Iron Men. When you finally get to the ferry ship that will take you to the island, you are handcuffed with another man, and both of you are shackled together. You're ordered to walk 10 feet forward and cross a gangplank, and then onto the ship. You're surrounded by law enforcement and prison guards. All this is happening without the press looking on, because the authorities have kept the operation a secret. Only one lone photographer got news of the move. At Alcatraz's dock, you and the guy you're chained to walk between rows of guards. 2 by 2, you're marched through the gate into the yard, and then into the cell house. You're searched and given a number, after which you're allocated a cell. Now your cuffs are removed and you are free of the other man. But before you can go into your cell, you're taken to the bathhouse and stripped naked. You're examined in every nook and cranny of your body, and then told you can wash. You're then taken to a cell and the door is locked. Outside is a sign that has your name and number. The authorities will later say that the entire operation went perfectly. Okay, so what does your cell look like? You're assigned to Block B. You might move to C later, and Block A, you'll learn, isn't used much at all to incarcerate men. D Block is solitary, a segregation center where a prisoner can be locked up 24 hours a day. These cells are sometimes referred to as confinement chambers. You might get let out in the yard for an hour once a week if you get on the right side of the guards, but other than that, you face total isolation if you're sent there. So your cell in Block B is 5 feet by 9 feet. Proverbially speaking, if you were to swing a cat in there, you'd kill it. Inside that cell is a cot that you can sleep on, and it's made out of steel. It folds against the wall when not being used because there really isn't that much space in the cell. There's a steel shelf to sit on and a steel shelf to put things on. There's also a basin and a toilet. Everything you own when you first get into that cell is a toothbrush, some tooth powder, 2 towels, and a cup. There will be books to read, so you can fill that shelf at some point. You will be able to get visits if you're good, but only once a month and non-contact. If you fall sick, then there's a hospital in the prison. Over the coming year, some big names will arrive at the prison, including the man known as George Machine Gun Kelly. Others that arrive have been convicted of what the press call most atrocious crimes. Alcatraz is called the end of the line, the last resort. It holds formidable robbers and ruthless murderers, and it especially holds anyone who has tried to escape from another prison, or a prisoner that has hurt or killed a prison guard where he was housed. Maybe the most famous criminals to stay on the rock is the mafia crime lord Al Capone. He actually arrived shortly after you. So there you are, sitting in your cell. You receive a booklet, and it's called Regulations for Inmates USP Alcatraz. It tells you that what you have right now is what you're entitled to. The clothes on your back, the roof over your head, and some bathroom items. Anything else you might receive is a privilege, and to get more things you'll have to show good conduct and a good work ethic. You might even get some time taken off your sentence. But show bad conduct and the opposite might happen. You might lose privileges, get some time added on, or be sent to those isolation cells. This is nothing you haven't read before. In bold letters, the booklet tells you that there will be no trading, gambling, selling, giving, or loaning. They mean this too. You will work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. The rest of the time will be recreation time and cell time. You can watch a movie twice a month, and if you show good conduct, you'll be able to go out to the yard and play handball. You're also told that this won't happen just yet, since your first 30 days will be spent in your cell. This is called the quarantine period. It doesn't sound too bad, only you guess the guards will be stricter. That is very true. You'll wake up at 7 a.m. and you'll be counted. You must be absolutely silent during this time or you'll be disciplined. This rule of silence will be the thing that gets to you the most, and the guards are serious about it. You might have your own cell, but the silence kills you. You can try talking through the toilet bowl, but that will get you in serious trouble. You can talk when you eat with the other prisoners. The food at least isn't that bad. In fact, you're quite impressed with the chow. For breakfast one day, you get oatmeal, milk, sausage, fried potatoes, toast, and coffee. For dinner, you get some bean soup, roast beef, and veg. For your supper, you get pork and beans, salad, more coffee, and bread. On another day, the breakfast is similar, but dinner consists of breaded cod, potato chowder, cabbage bread, and tea. For supper one evening, you get vegetable soup, spaghetti and meatballs, fruit pudding and bread. They even throw in some spiced apples. What's going on? You're eating better than you did on the outside, and a lot better than the many Americans living in abject poverty. In the years to come, the delicious food at Alcatraz will become legendary, and it'll make any prisoner in the present day wish he was taken back in time as he chows down on his single slice of moldy bread and dubious slop filled with mystery meat and gristle. At Alcatraz, the wardens believe that healthy food and tasty food will lead to good behavior and cut down on violence. 3 good meals a day should keep the prisoner in good physical and mental health. You are what you eat, and your warden believes slop doesn't align with good behavior. Alcatraz is quite progressive in this respect. Okay, so you've got your pounded beef steak with gravy and mash, and you're not going to complain about that. The silence thing gets to you, but as you follow all the rules, you at least get time on the yard and books to read. It's a bit cramped in the cell, but at least you don't have to share with a man who has a history of atrocious violence. What can go wrong? Well, that routine is so strict that it can feel oppressive. It's final lockup at 4:50 p.m. and lights out at 9:30 p.m. And until the next day, you're not supposed to make a sound. A man named Edward Wutke doesn't take to Alcatraz very well. He's prisoner number 47, and he's the first man to take his life in there. More will follow. There is bullying, of course, and this leads one man to severely hurt himself. He wants to get transferred because of the bullying he faces daily. So for you, as long as you don't get bullied, life could be okay. You just have to adhere to the strictest of routines. You even get to go to the library, and since you're eating well and exercising, you might actually get rehabilitated. In fact, as an average prisoner, you'll get to go through almost 100 books a year. As the years go by, you'll get the chance to use a musical instrument and listen to a radio. The problem is, what if you don't follow the rules? Well, that's when Alcatraz turns into Hellcatraz. Let's just add that it's very easy to break the rules. That code of silence is enforced with enthusiasm, and you also have to look presentable at all times. Your cell has to be spotless, and come rain or shine, you have to work really hard. There's no shirking at Alcatraz, and so you might say it's run in a zero-tolerance style. Now, with that in mind, the place is full of notorious criminals with problems of self-control. Things can go wrong. Let's say one day you just can no longer cope with the oppressive rules and you start talking at night and not cleaning your cell. You're sent to isolation, and then you do the same again. You hit out at people and talk back to guards. That's when you go to D block and get put in one of the cells from 9 to 14. This is known as the hole, and before you get thrown in there, you're stripped naked and beaten. The guards will come back and torture you now and again. You lie on a cold concrete floor and there is no light that comes into the cell. You can shower once a week, and you might get out in the yard for an hour in the week. The rest of the time is spent in that cold, dark cell, being treated worse than an animal. You're given no toothbrush or soap to clean yourself. At one point, a guard throws cold water on you. The cell stinks like a sewer, too, and you can forget about that tasty food. You're given 4 slices of bread a day, and then once a week you get a proper meal. In conclusion, Alcatraz is a foreboding place just to look at, and it comes with ruthless men who might bully and kill you. The food is good, but some men just can't cope with the rules. This is what one of your fellow inmates says about that. Men go slowly insane under the exquisite torture of restricted and undeviating routine. Men crack, and then they're punished, sometimes severely, and this happens a lot. The question is, will you crack or will you get through it? You would think that when strapped to a gurney, knowing the life force in you is about to expire, you'd want to say something nice to someone, or profound, or perhaps apologize to the family of the victim that's watching your demise. Then again, if you were an innocent person about to have his veins filled with a lethal cocktail, you might not be in the mood to deliver a tender speech. You might also be a ruthless and heartless psychopath that wants to fill the air one last time with your monstrous voice. As you'll now find out, that has happened, and it might send shivers down your spine hearing what they said. First up, Richard Aaron Cobb. Cobb was executed by lethal injection in 2013 in Texas. His crime was walking into a convenience store with an accomplice and robbing it. It didn't stop there. They took 2 female employees and 1 male customer and forced them into a car. They took them to a secluded place and shot them execution style, and then drove away thinking they were all dead. Only the man actually died. His last words were very strange, starting out nihilistic. He then finished with something very surprising. I hope that someday this absurdity that humanity has come to will come to an end. and then seconds later after he started to pass away. Wow, this is great. Thank you, Warden. This next one is slightly more gruesome. John Wayne Gacy. You all know the story of this man, and we won't go into detail about what he did. He murdered 33 people in the 70s and hid many of the bodies under his house. He is one of the USA's worst serial killers. His last words show that he had no remorse whatsoever. They were, "Kiss my..." we can't say that last word, otherwise the video will get demonetized. But we are sure you can guess what it is. There's no cursing in this next one, but we think you'll agree it's pretty darn dark. Peter Kürten. You've never heard of this guy, we bet. He was a German serial killer at a time where there were few of them about in Germany. That was the early 20th century. He killed at least 9 people and did terrible things with the bodies. One other thing was that he drank the blood of his victims, and that's why he was sometimes named the Vampire of Dusseldorf. In 1931, he was beheaded by guillotine, and just before that happened, he looked at his psychiatrist and said, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Before the blade came down, the psychiatrist replied, "No." Eileen Wuornos. This woman you might have seen portrayed in a Hollywood movie called Monster. She worked selling her body on the streets and killed 6 of her male customers. She claimed she was defending herself, but that didn't hold up in court. She's now known as one of America's worst female serial killers. She was executed in 2002, and just before that, she promised she'd come back to life again. She said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Sticking with serial murderers, this next monster fits the bill. Carl Panzram. This guy was a serial killer in the US at the start of the 20th century. He committed murders among many other despicable things. He said he had killed 22 people in all. He was sentenced to be hanged in 1930, and just before the executioner put the cover on his head, he spat in his face. He was asked if he had any last words. This is how he replied, "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." In case you're wondering, a Hoosier is someone from the state of Indiana. Up next is arguably the funniest on this list, James French. French killed 2 people in the late 50s and mid-60s in the USA. One of those people was his cellmate. The two didn't get along very well. His actual last words when sitting in the electric chair were, "There's nothing else to say." But the last thing he said to a reporter was this, "If I were covering my execution, do you know what I'd say in the newspaper headline tomorrow?" The reporter said, "What?" He answered, "French fries." Yep, that was amusing. We think this next guy was also attempting to make a joke. Jeffrey Matthews. Matthews shot and killed his uncle during a robbery, and he was executed in 2011 in Oklahoma because of that. His last words aren't exactly frightening, but his dark sense of humor at the end is perhaps a little bit shocking. He said a few things, but his very last words were, "I think that governor's phone is broke. He hasn't called yet." Robert Charles Comer. You can say the same about this man. At the end, he either had a twisted sense of humor or was on another planet, mentally speaking. In 1987, he killed a man, but he had also committed some other serious crimes throughout his life. When he asked if he wanted to say something at the end, he said, "Go Raiders." That's in reference to an American football team. Such a statement, you might assume, encapsulates how little he thought about himself and life and his victims. Robert Alton Harris. Alton was executed in California in 1992 for multiple murders. He'd been a career criminal with a long rap sheet, although his killing of 2 boys is why he got the gas chamber. He was incredibly heartless if you read his story, but we won't go into it today. At the end, he became poetic, his last words being, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." He's not wrong about that. He's not as amusing as the next person, though. Vincent Gutierrez. This guy was executed in Texas in 2007 after being found guilty of killing a man. Gutierrez had been trying to steal the man's car and then shot him in the back. He was under the age of 18 when it happened. He said a few things for his last words and apologized for what he had done. But then he finished it off by saying, "Where's my stunt double when you need one?" John William Rook. Rook believed his difficult childhood was the reason he committed a murder in 1980 in the US. He had 12 hot dogs for his last meal. And then, just before they took his life away, he thanked them and said, "Freedom, freedom at last." James W. Rogers. Rogers was sentenced to death after killing a fellow worker at a uranium mine in 1957. The two had fallen out over quite a big issue, and that was how a scoop shovel should be properly greased. They didn't see eye to eye regarding the grease, and Rogers shot the other man. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. When Rogers was ready to have the firing squad finish his life, he was asked if he had any final words. His reply was, "I done told you my last request, a bulletproof vest." Charlie Livingston. In 1983, this man shot and killed a woman in Houston during a robbery. He didn't seem to see the point of final words when the time came, and he made that point, saying, "You all brought me here to be executed, not to make a speech. That's it." That was simple enough, quite different from what's coming up. Douglas Roberts. This man from Texas was quite the opposite, and he had quite a lot to say on the day of his execution by lethal injection in 2005. He'd been found guilty of kidnapping, robbery, and murder. When the time came for his last words, he said, "I've been hanging around this popsicle stand way too long. Before I leave, I want to tell you all, when I die, bury me deep, lay 2 speakers at my feet, put some headphones on my head, and rock and roll me when I'm dead." The media later reported that he was upbeat and animated before his execution. Frederick Wood. Wood was another joker, albeit with a dark sense of humor. He was put to the electric chair in 1963 for the crime of murder. When asked what his final words would be, he replied, "Gents, this is an educational project. You're about to witness the damaging effect electricity has on wood." The next couple of people you could say are unique on this list. Mary Blandy. Now we're going really back in time, and this is the story of an English woman whose father didn't approve of her relationship. She looked to poison to deal with this problem. She was hanged in 1752, and at the time she was wearing a dress. She was worried people might look up the dress, even though it wouldn't matter much after she was dead. Still, she told the executioner, "For the sake of decency, gentlemen, don't hang me high." Sarah Good. Now we go even farther back to the Salem trials in Massachusetts in 1692. Good was in her 30s when she was accused of being a witch and then sentenced to death. All 12 jurors agreed that she had to be a witch. She was accused of lacking in self-discipline and being a servant of the devil. She had only challenged locals regarding their very strict Puritan values, but they had said that made her in league with Satan. The Reverend Nicholas Noyes was there at the end and still tried to get her to confess, and she of course refused. Her last words were, "I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." 25 years later, Noyes had an aneurysm, and as the story goes, he coughed up blood and choked on it. We should say this is what's called popular legend. But as the witch trials were so terrible, we imagine many people might hope it happened. While these witch trials were madness to the highest degree, Mary's husband at least sued the courts for what's happened to her, and he won. Now we go back to the present day and a couple of guys that look death straight in the eye. Clarence Ray Allen. This man was executed in California for killing 3 people. He was executed in 2006 when he was the ripe old age of 76. He was very sick at the time, and a lot of people wondered why the death sentence, since it seemed he didn't have much time left anyway. His last words were, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die." Melvin White. White had committed the terrible crime of murdering a child, and he was executed in Texas in 2005. We won't go into the details, but what he did shocked a lot of people. Not many folks felt sorry for this man as he went to the gurney for his dose of lethal drugs. He did say he was sorry for what he did and then said, "All right, Warden, let's give them what they want." The next couple of people you might say didn't sit too well in their chair of death. Tory Twain McNabb. In 2017, this man was given lethal injection in the state of Alabama. He'd been convicted of killing a police officer. He and his lawyers had tried to stop it going through by saying the punishment was cruel and unusual, but that didn't work. He went to the gurney an angry man, and with both his hands, he pointed 2 middle fingers in the air. He then said, "Mom, sis, look at my eyes. I got no tears. I'm unafraid. To the state of Alabama, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." Thomas J. Grasso. We have perhaps saved the strangest last words to last. And this was the execution of a man that had been convicted of 2 murders of elderly women. He was given lethal injection in the state of Oklahoma in 1995. He wrote a short poem before his death, and part of it went like this: "The warden will read my last creed, and the deadly brew will flow, as the poison drips into my veins, and from my body life does drain." But his last words were in the form of a very practical complaint. We guess he was being ironic. Those words were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." There seems to be some disagreement as to who has spent the most time in solitary confinement. But you can find a handful of people that did over 40 years without much contact with other people. The record might well be smashed by the British prisoner called Robert Maudsley, aka the Brain Eater, or the real-life Hannibal the Cannibal, who's now done over 40 years in solitary. The man we're going to talk about today might be behind in terms of years spent kept away from the other prison population, but there's another reason he's called the most isolated prisoner in the world. Mr. Silverstein, who was born in 1952, has been in prison since 1977. Back then, he was convicted of armed robbery and sent to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas to do his time. You might be curious why armed robbery with no deaths would warrant such a long sentence, but it's what Tommy did inside the prison that made the difference. He has been given the epithet America's most dangerous prisoner, and while the media is prone to exaggeration at times, he certainly has been very dangerous within the confines of U.S. prisons. During his time behind bars, he's been convicted of killing 4 people, although one of those convictions was overturned. For that, he was later given a specially designed solitary cell, and one that he would have to spend 24 hours a day in 7 days a week. According to blog posts written not long before we started writing this show, Silverstein had some very serious health complications, but we're told that the Bureau of Prisons will not release any information as to his condition. He was put into intensive care, although we're told not even his family were allowed to visit him. This is how isolated this prisoner is, and we should add that by the time you watch this show, there might not even be a Tommy Silverstein. But now let's look at how he got into this point in his life. We're told that Tommy grew up in Long Beach, California. While pregnant with him, his mother got a divorce, though she then married again. Silverstein claims that the second man is his real father. He wasn't around that long anyway because his mother divorced again and married a Mr. Silverstein, and this man legally adopted the young Tommy. From what we can see, he didn't exactly come from the wrong side of the tracks. It's said he lived a middle-class kind of life, but was very shy and certainly not a tough kid at the start. He was bullied for various reasons, but it's written that because of his name, the other kids used to pick on him for being Jewish in a neighborhood where there weren't many Jewish people. It's said he soon toughened up and fought back, with Silverstein saying his mother didn't suffer fools or bullies gladly. Most bio websites post this comment that Silverstein once made about his childhood. "That's how my mom was. She stood her mud. If someone came at you with a bat, you got your bat and you both went at it." So it seems he was a slightly troubled kid, but he didn't get into serious trouble until he was 19 years old. That's when he was arrested for armed robbery the first time. He was sent to San Quentin and served 4 years. Not long after getting out, he met his father, the real one that he says is his biological father, and also his uncle. The 3 were eventually arrested for 3 armed robberies. It seemed Silverstein, being so young, garnered some sympathy, with those people saying the young man had been taken in by the older men. The judge wasn't buying any of that lack of parental guidance stuff though, and sentenced Tommy to 15 years. He wouldn't get out of prison again and might never if his present sickness gets the better of him. Even if he survives that, it's very unlikely he'll ever get out of prison again. It's said his release date is officially 2095. So if he makes it to 143, he might feel the wind on his back again. While in prison in Kansas, he developed a friendship with members of the Aryan Brotherhood. In 1980, Tommy, now 28, was convicted of killing a fellow inmate. The story goes that the inmate had turned down an offer he couldn't refuse. That was to be a drug mule for the white gang. This is what the TV show Crime Investigation had to say. As an inductee of the Aryan Brotherhood, Terrible Tom happily committed acts of violence, which soon escalated to murder. He violently killed DC Black's gang member Danny Atwell. We should say, though, that his conviction was overturned, with some of the witnesses later charged with lying in court. Silverstein was then sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which was said to be a very tough prison. Silverstein had been given a life sentence for that murder, but obviously that had been reversed after the perjury charge. But then he was accused of killing another DC Blacks member, Robert Chappelle. Silverstein always denied this, and then the Bureau of Prisons did something one could call worthy of redress. They moved the nationwide leader of the DC Blacks, Raymond Cadillac Smith, to Marion while Silverstein was on trial for Chappelle's murder. "I tried to tell Cadillac that I didn't kill Chappelle, but he didn't believe me and he bragged that he was going to kill me," Silverstein would later say. He added that no one tried to keep the men apart, and it was believed by him and the other prisoners that the guards wanted one of the men to kill the other. A more cynical person would say that the system wanted one less violent inmate. The one less they eventually got was Cadillac, who was stabbed 67 times by Silverstein. He did this with another member of the Aryan Brotherhood called Clayton Fountain. Crime Investigation writes that Silverstein walked up and down the wing with the dead body to show the others what might happen if they decided to try and take him out. We're told after this he became one of the top guys in the Aryan Brotherhood. He was also given another life sentence. So now we bring in an officer called Merle Eugene Klutz. He was supposed to maintain order in the violent wing of the prison, but Silverstein has always maintained that Klutz came in with a very heavy hand. He was there to especially watch Silverstein, and the latter said that he didn't only watch him, but regularly tormented him. That culminated with the death of Klutz. One day in 1983, he and other guards were taking Silverstein to the shower block. On the way, with the help of another prisoner, Silverstein got out of his handcuffs with a homemade key and stabbed the officer with a shank or a homemade weapon that he'd been handed. The autopsy report revealed that Silverstein stabbed Klutz around 40 times. Silverstein has always said he did this because Klutz had treated him particularly badly, even for prison. An investigation revealed that wasn't the case, but Silverstein said the investigation itself was corrupt. He was transferred to a different prison at this time, where he murdered another guard. What followed was a 23-year lockdown at Marion. Some say these two incidents were the reason the first Supermax prison was built in the US. You might guess that this was the beginning of Silverstein's days in solitary. It wasn't normal solitary though. It was what's called total isolation. That means 24 hours a day in the cell and lights are on all the time. His security status was no human contact. Not many prisoners get this, with Silverstein and the British maniac we mentioned at the start of the show being the most notorious. Advocates of human rights have said such isolation is not far from a torture technique used by the military and sometimes extremists called whitewashing. Gradually, the BOP started giving Silverstein books and a TV. But skeptics say this only happened because the Bureau realized that in order to really punish someone in prison, the prisoner can't just have nothing. You need to give him something and then take it away. This is the Torture 101 style we see in the movies, such as Silence of the Lambs when Dr. Lecter has his books taken away. We should add that his self-contained cell is a bit bigger than usual cells. For one thing, it has to have a shower as he can't go to the shower room. We've seen plenty of sketches online that Tommy himself drew of his cell. We might also add that Silverstein didn't hate all guards. In a now famous case, one part of a prison was overtaken by Cuban rioters in 1987. Silverstein was let out of his cell, and he could go anywhere he liked for a short time. The Cubans held guards hostage, and so the authorities were concerned that Silverstein would hurt or even kill them. One of the guards had known Silverstein for a long time, but no bad came to him. It said he had always been kind to the prisoner, asking him on occasions if his handcuffs were too tight. Still, Silverstein said some of the guards would torment him often. In fact, you can read a blog that includes a note written by Silverstein that must have been written just before he fell ill. There he talks about deprivation, saying, "Dear friends and supporters, as I've noted for decades with each new warden administration, that they rotate every 3 years or so, usually takes away from what we've got instead of gives us more." He adds, "They gotta flex their muscles as cowards do with the hopeless and helpless." In the last paragraph, he talks about what his solitary confinement is like, saying, "Like the monotone bars and walls that entomb me, they've stamped out the colors of happiness that I enjoy sharing with the outside world, enforcing a black and white existence in this colorless hole of madness." Other blog posts written by friends of Silverstein tell us that his writing and art have been confiscated at times, and getting anything creative out of prison has been hard. We found a lot more of Tommy's thoughts that have been published on blogs. He writes in other posts that, unlike even the worst case of confinement, he can't even shout across a corridor. His isolation is what you might call extreme solitude. He writes that things have happened to him that have never been reported, and he adds that inside the prison walls things go on that seldom make it onto those prison TV shows. For him, the penal system is unjust. The prison system in general is not about rehabilitation for the most part, he believes. As for solitary, he writes, "History and studies clearly show that solitary confinement does more harm than good, that it reveals the idiocy and sadistic mentality of prison administrators who embrace this barbaric medieval practice, and that it is a crime against humanity." The guards didn't see it that way, with one prison official once telling an author, "We can't execute Silverstein, so we have no choice but to make his life a living hell. Otherwise, inmates will kill guards too. There has to be some supreme punishment." We should add that Silverstein does get to visit people now and again, but never in close quarters and always with glass and a telephone. One visitor recently wrote, he was told there were certain things he was not allowed to discuss with me, one being the book he is writing. Tom talked about his desire to further his education. I had no idea there's no longer funding for prisoners to study. A man is dragged into a prison cell kicking and screaming, but it's too late for the officers on watch to do anything. The door to the cell is barricaded from the inside, and all those officers can do is plead to the man's captor while they hear him howl in pain. For hours this goes on until at some point the victim's dead body is held up to the window of the cell. The cell door is opened, and to the guard's utter disbelief, a spoon is stuck into the victim's exposed brain. His head looks not dissimilar from a cracked boiled egg. That's just one of the reasons why the protagonist of this story, one Robert Maudsley, is dubbed Britain's most violent prisoner, aka the real-life Hannibal the Cannibal, or to others, the Brain Eater. Born on the 26th of June 1953, Robert Maudsley did not get what you might call a good start in life. He might one day be nicknamed Spoons, but he certainly wasn't born with anything close to a silver spoon in his mouth. Quite the opposite, in fact. When he was just 6 years old, he and his siblings were taken into care when the UK's social services discovered that all the children had suffered neglect at the hands of their parents. He was one of 12 children in that working-class family, but it was his brothers Paul and Kevin and his sister Brenda who would share the same care home. That was a place called Nazareth House, a Catholic orphanage in Liverpool, England. Care homes sometimes don't always have a good reputation in the UK, especially ones from back in those days. But it was there that the highly intelligent Robert would have a good relationship with the nuns he loved and trusted, and the siblings who lived with him there. Then, after 8 years living in the care home, disaster struck. The parents, a couple already accused of being unworthy to bring up children, took the kids back. What was passive neglect in the past would now become active torture. Their home became a house of horrors. The kids were beaten daily, but the extremely violent father, the perpetrator of most of those beatings, liked more than anything to take his rage out on young Robert. He looked upon this one child with a special kind of hatred. After all, it was Robert that tried to stick up for his other siblings. At one point during his preteen years, Robert was locked in a room for 6 months. The door opened when he was given scraps of food and glasses of water. If it wasn't feeding time, there was only one other reason why that door was unlocked. Speaking to a psychologist from possibly the world's most secure prison cell, Robert would later recall, "I can always still remember now when he turned that lock. When he came in, he'd have a poker or a piece of wood in his hand, or even a rifle, and I can remember he busted that rifle over my back, and when he'd beaten me, he closed the door. I'd hear the key turn and he'd walk away laughing." Such was the depravity that Robert experienced, a boy that would become known as a Mr. Maudsley, the serial killer. It was after these series of beatings that his mother and father sent him back to social services, and from there Robert lived in various foster homes. The father told his brothers and sisters that Robert had died, and that was that. They wouldn't see him again, and there would be no funeral. The other kids were too young, too afraid to question what had happened to their brother. When Robert became a teenager, he left Liverpool, but the scars from his past would prove to be the locus of his future direction. He got the bus down to London, hoping that there was something new and exciting waiting for him. But in the big city, all he found was more pain. The young man couldn't escape the abominations of his past. He didn't exactly thrive on the streets of London and spent years on and off staying in the city's psychiatric hospitals after attempting to take his own life. He became enmeshed in hard drugs, and to feed his addiction, he offered sexual services to men he met in the city's pubs and clubs. While working as a male prostitute in 1973, he met a man named John Farrell. This is when Robert, now just 21 years old, killed his first person. In what might be considered shameless and vile gloating, Farrell showed Maudsley disturbing images of children he had sexually abused. This resonated with Maudsley. He was incensed, and he snapped. He was looking at the images of children that had shared a similar fate to his own. He lured Farrell into a public toilet, and with a garrote he'd fashioned from a necktie, he strangled the abuser to death. This was a very personal kind of crime. Maudsley watched fixedly as the life force drained from his victim. He took pleasure from it. It was revenge for his own childhood suffering and for the suffering of the boys in the photos. The excitement, the pleasure that Maudsley derived from this violent act would be felt again when he got up close to other people he considered beasts of the earth. Maudsley, undoubtedly unhinged and dangerous himself, had no scruples about murdering men he viewed as animals. Following the strangulation, Maudsley didn't even attempt to hide the crime or run away. He was soon picked up by police, who gave him the nickname Blue due to the color of the man's face who he had killed. For Maudsley, he had done the world a favor. He rid the streets of a man who made innocent children suffer. He'd become a vigilante, a deranged rebel with a cause. And if you asked him about his actions, he'd tell you he'd done the righteous thing. In his own mind, he'd killed his own father, or at least someone that represented the reprehensible things his father had done. Maudsley was handed an indeterminate life sentence and later sent to Broadmoor, a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. There he was locked up among some people he detested the most, men who abused children. For some years, Moseley didn't strike out, but then in 1977, when he was 24 years old, he and an accomplice grabbed a convicted pedophile named David Francis and rushed him into a cell. What followed was a 9-hour attack in which the victim was mercilessly beaten and tortured. After the 9 hours, when the prison officers finally managed to get through the door, Francis was dead. A spoon had been stuck in his ear and had penetrated his brain. Multiple injuries showed that he'd sustained a gradual but extreme attack. According to one prison guard, the victim's head had been cracked open like a boiled egg, and bits of the dead man's brain were missing. Again, Moseley was convinced he had done the moral thing, and he'd only taken out another evil person. For this reason, the authorities said the crime was premeditated, and so Moseley was in fact not insane. He was moved to Wakefield Prison, at the time a hellhole nicknamed Monster Mansion, and well known as a place feared by criminals. Because Moseley had hated being moved as a child back to his parents' house, he resented being moved to a prison. Yet again, many people who inhabited that prison were the kind of men that made children suffer in the worst ways imaginable. What Moseley saw all around were his nemesis, men who needed to be removed from the planet. He believed he had every right to do what he did. In a letter many years into his imprisonment, Moseley wrote, "I can say that yes, I have been raped, and yes, I have been sexually abused by such people, and consequently I do detest these people enough to have killed them in the past. So we have their circumstances from my childhood and adolescence." In July 1978, only around a year after the spoon incident, Moseley made a plan. That was to kill 7 child abusers in the space of one day. Since he'd been in Wakefield Prison, he'd taken his time to know who was who, and over a few months he picked out certain people and put them on his kill list. On the day he planned his murder spree, he invited a man named Solly Darwood to his cell for a chat. Darwood was serving time for killing his wife. No sooner than he entered Moseley's cell, he was stabbed several times with a homemade knife, commonly known as a shiv or a shank in the USA. This time, he hadn't actually killed a child abuser, but in Moseley's mind, he killed the person he believed was scum of the earth. He thought he'd done the moral thing. Criminologists sometimes call this kind of killer the missionary type, because they perceive their killing mission as justice being served. While mission serial killers are inarguably maniacal, it's not common in prison for men to justify the murder of a child or a woman abuser as a righteous act. The act is supposedly mitigated by the offense the victim was convicted of. Moseley wouldn't stop until, in his own mind, he had cleaned up the prison. He pushed the now dead Darwood under the bottom bunk in the cell and started calling out more names, asking people if they wanted to come for a chat. No one accepted the invite, so with knife in hand, Moseley went on the prowl. One prisoner would later recall that he could see murder in Moseley's eyes. The toughest men in the prison feared for their lives. While walking along the landing, he soon arrived at another cell, this time occupied by a child abuser named William Roberts. Within minutes, Roberts was dead. His head had been smashed against a wall several times, and his skull had been hacked at with a shiv. Moseley then calmly walked up to the prison officers and said to them, "There will be 2 less people for roll call this evening." So in 1978, Mr. Moseley, no longer a man the prison staff wanted roaming their landings or exercising in the yard, ended up in solitary confinement. To say he would stay there a while would be an understatement, because he's still there now and is Britain's longest-serving prisoner. But that story doesn't stop there, because at the time, few people had ever heard of Robert Moseley. At least the general public had no idea who he was. In the years to come, though, he'd become a household name. In 1982, the BBC went to Wakefield Prison to make a documentary about solitary confinement, and they found a man confined to a cell, a man known as a bomb that the authorities couldn't disarm. They discovered someone who had been labeled as a kind of penitential enemy number 1, and indeed the prison's most dangerous prisoner. Moseley's name was soon all over the British tabloid press, with some of the more spurious stories saying that this crazed man had eaten the brains of a fellow prisoner. While that wasn't true, and it's known by most people in the UK that the tabloids often don't let the facts get in the way of a good tale, the prison now felt it had to make an example of Moseley. Its answer to solving the problem of Moseley's infamy was to do something quite drastic. That was to create a kind of cell that had never been seen in the UK before, and perhaps has never been seen anywhere else in the world. It was a place the authorities believed Moseley could cause no more harm. In 1983, they built a maximum security special unit within a maximum security prison, not in the actual prison but in the basement of the prison. Moseley's new cell was a reinforced bulletproof plexiglass cage, a cage where he was under watch 24 hours a day. To get to the cage, guards must open a solid steel door. Within the cement walls of the cell is yet another cell, and that is the exterior, that is the plexiglass cage. A psychologist that visited Moseley there called him gaunt, emaciated, sunken-faced figure with long, straggly hair. Although he has a high IQ and is a fan of reading, he is not allowed any books. Although he's a fan of classical music, he's not allowed to listen to music. In fact, his own words is, "There is nothing in this cell but damp walls and cockroaches." The guards have been told not to talk to him, so when he does occasionally get an hour outside in yet another cage, he doesn't get to speak. If he even looks at the guards, they avert their eyes. When he does go outside because of his violent past, he has to be escorted by 4 to 6 guards. This has gone on for years, and because of this absolute isolation and lack of communication, he's developed speech problems. He's literally going out of his mind and has been denied a pet budgie so that he might have some company. The authorities have also denied his request for a cyanide pill so he can take his own life. Robert Maudsley is now 66 years old and has served 46 years in prison, with around 40 of those years being in solitary confinement. When he's been given the chance to speak, he has said that this solitary confinement is a constant reminder of those 6 months he spent locked in a room as a child. It's unlikely he'll ever get out of prison, and unlikely that he'll ever get out of his glass cage in the dungeon of Wakefield Prison. Maudsley believes he's a victim of circumstance more than anything, and that the people he killed was a form of displaced anger related to what had happened to him as a child and a young man. Not surprisingly, he mostly blames his parents. "We'll leave you with these words," he once said. "When I kill, I think I have my parents in mind. Had I killed my parents in 1970, none of these people need have died. If I had killed them, then I'd be walking around as a free man without a care in the world." A 20-year-old man, a man who believes he has become a victim of the justice system in the US, wants out. In the psych ward where he's been placed, he bides his time until he sees his chance to get into a medical cabinet. The man has no problem picking locks. He'll pick many locks for many years to come. Inside that cabinet is a bottle of the extremely potent psychotropic substance called LSD. He takes the bottle of that, and again, when the time is right, he sneaks into the staff room and pours the entire bottle into a pot of boiling coffee. The incoming and outgoing staff are all gonna get a hit you could call heroic. In his own words, the man later said, "The plan was when all the people were freaked out enough, I was going to pick the locks and go." A few aides and staff on the ward between them unwittingly took acid to the amount of around 100 tabs. Perhaps you're not the type of person who knows much about things like LSD, but let us tell you, 100 tabs between a handful of people would have caused them to hallucinate wildly. The plan didn't exactly go how that guy wanted it to go. Far from it. Not long after those coffees were drunk, one aide was down in the basement watching the clothes dryer spin around and around. His pupils were now large black shimmering discs, and he stared at that spinning drum and just lost his mind. The machine became his mortal enemy. The aide screamed at the dryer, he threw punches at it, kicked it. While upstairs in the ward, people were tripping out of their minds. One of the female psychiatric doctors didn't seem to know where she was or who she was. She was seen madly dancing up and down the ward and, in a sexually suggestive way, informing the shocked inmates about how deliriously hot she was feeling. The scene was a phantasmagoria of horror and comedy. But during all that utter madness, the plotter and executor of that communal trip could not make his escape. Security was soon called and the staff were taken to some place to calm down from their mega trip. A clothes dryer had been ripped apart and, in one man's eyes, defeated. Welcome to the life of Mark DeFreist, the Houdini of Florida, a masterful escape artist, a veritable genius who just couldn't find his way in life. A life that from the outside might look part comedy, but in reality, his life sentence on this earth has been filled mostly with devastating tragedy. Mark was born in 1960 and grew up with his father and stepmom. His father had served during the Second World War in the OSS, an organization that would later evolve into the CIA. Father and son were close, and the former imparted his vast knowledge to the latter. This would serve Mark well in his many prison escapes, but the child was different. Some say he was a savant. Most others now say he was a high-functioning autistic, and still is today. Mark didn't understand much about the world and didn't socialize much with other kids. He spent most of his time by himself, and he despised school. They moved him to a disciplinary boys' school to temper the child's waywardness, but he ran away, something he would keep doing his entire life. All he really wanted to do was take things apart and put them back together again. At the back of the house, there was a workshop, something Mark would later call his Frankenstein's lab. There, he would mess around with chemicals, blowing himself up on 2 occasions, and he would rewire appliances, take apart clocks, all with the skill and dexterity of a seasoned expert. His life fell apart when he was 19. His father died, and knowing what Mark loved most, he bequeathed all his tools to him. This was the start of the beginning of tragedy because Mark, not really knowing how wills work, took the tools before that will had been probated. That just means made valid. His cold and stony stepmother, a woman who had never cared for Mark, called the cops. Those cops chased Mark down one night, and on seeing those flashing lights, this young man who didn't quite get how things worked in society fled on foot. He had no idea why those cops were after him. He had no idea about how wills were supposed to be dealt with. He was arrested and charged with theft, and also got a charge for being in possession of a weapon. Next came jail. This just didn't seem fair to the young man, a guy that thought he'd taken what was rightly his. One day after Bible study class, he and the other inmates were being led back to their cells, when some men just started running for it, heading to the razor wire fence. None of them got over, but Mark knew exactly how to scale such a fence because his father once taught him how it could be done. Mark then hot-wired a car, hit the road, and settled into a motel for the night. This was his problem. He understood the technical aspects related to escape, but he didn't have the nous, the worldliness, the social intellect to evade the authorities for long. He got 6 more charges after that. He went back to jail, where he was jumped by 14 inmates who didn't quite understand this weird kid, who didn't fit in but wasn't afraid to talk back to them. Those 14 so-called tough guys beat him badly and sexually abused him. After that, Mark slit his wrists. He hit his head against the cell door. He screamed and shouted all day long, and soon he was taken to that psych ward where he would spike a coffee pot with an entire bottle of LSD. The prison system and the justice system thought that what they had was an unruly kid who'd been lucky to get over a razor wire fence. They didn't much like the inmate. He was troublesome, he used bad language, and he would often not do as he was told. For that, over the years, Mark would be beaten time and again by the guards. He had to escape, that's all he ever thought about. You have to see, in his mind, a mind that worked differently from most people's, he'd only taken his father's tools, and those tools had been given to him. The escapes, to Mark's reasoning, were not crimes, but the right thing to do. He was, in fact, just being very rational. Tools equal mine, imprisonment equals wrong, escape equals right. One day, he was asked if he'd like to join a new woodwork and arts crafts activity. Of course he would. This was a guy that was brilliant at making things, but when Mark saw rolled up copper sheets, the first thing that came to his mind was, they really mustn't want me to stay. That's because what he saw in the workshop were all the necessary bits and pieces to fashion a homemade gun, aka a zip gun. With the copper, he made the gun barrel, and then he fixed that to a homemade pistol grip. When he had the gun ready, the next thing he did was steal an ice pick and take that back to his cell. He took that spike and ripped out one of his back teeth. With blood streaming from his mouth, he called a nurse and he was rushed to the psych ward prison hospital, albeit in handcuffs and leg chains. The dentist knew right away that this was an act of self-mutilation, and that's what he added to his report. After seeing the dentist, Mark asked if he could go for a pee. In the bathroom, he picked his locks again and produced his homemade gun. Pointing his zip gun at the guards, he shouted, "Anybody move and I'll blow your brains out." Some inmates in that ward, perhaps not in good mental shape, started jumping around and screaming. Mark shot a table just to prove to them his gun actually worked. After that, he was gone again, out the door and running through the nearby woods. But again, he just didn't quite know how to stay out. He stole yet another car but was soon caught. He was now making the headlines of local news media, but the prison system, they were starting to get pretty mad at the kid. He'd had his chances, now they wanted him to suffer. And suffer he did, in jail, while the authorities tried to figure out if this kid was mentally fit to stand trial. They kept him locked down for 24 hours a day. Was he fit to stand trial? 4 psychiatrists said no. No way, he's mentally ill. This man doesn't know what's right or wrong. Sure, he understands the court system and he's not raving mad. In fact, he's obviously very talented, but still, he doesn't know why he's here at all. He should not stand trial. One man said that wasn't the case, calling Mark a malingerer, meaning someone pretending to be mentally unwell. That same man decades later changed his mind. That didn't help the 20-year-old Mark, who was sent back to jail. There he made another gun, an improved version of his last zip gun, even though for this one he had to use an empty roll of toothpaste. "I was in my gunsmith phase, I could make a gun out of anything," Mark would later recall. This time he threatened the guards, and just to make sure the gun was working, he fired it at a wall. It was working alright, and many other inmates saw that Mark had not shot anywhere near the guards. But enough was enough. The guards beat Mark within an inch of his life and forced him into a pitch-black cell, naked, bruised, and broken. After 11 days of that, he took a plea deal without really knowing what a plea deal was. For firing at the wall, he was convicted of attempted murder. Later, he was sent to the Florida State Prison, a prison that at the time was said to be totally ungovernable, a prison where violence and murder was commonplace. No inmate in the US ever wanted to end up there. It confined the so-called worst of the worst, but as prisons go, it was the worst of the worst. Mark was still occasionally unruly. He still didn't really understand the prison system or the prison code, and he was beaten severely by both guards and inmates on many occasions. and so he started making homemade weapons. When they were found, he went back into the hole. His solitary confinement was often a life of total isolation. The order given by the prison authorities was no clothes for the prisoner, no mattress or sheets. Conversation with anyone was prohibited, which included prison trustees. He was given no toiletries, no tissues, no toothpaste, no soap. They turned off the water in his cell at times, and he couldn't even flush the toilet. He had to eat with his hands and in the total darkness. The torture and humiliation was later compared to what happened at Guantanamo Bay. He had to live in silence and darkness, naked, like a trapped animal. And if that's not cruel and unusual punishment, then what is? His punishment was nothing short of medieval, and arguably a form of modern-day torture. The prison put him on a consolidated security list, so when he wasn't in total darkness, he still wasn't allowed out of his cell. In his own words, he said, "You can go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years without ever seeing the yard." In total, he had 10 years of requests to see the sun, and they were all denied. But he still caught sight of the guards, and what he would do is study their keys. After examining them, he'd memorize the cuts in the keys and then make his own set out of paper. "I made keys for every lock in America," he said many years later. Did he ever get to use them? Well, Mark attempted to escape 13 times in all, and he was successful 7 times. One time he scaled the fence and broke both his feet. He somehow managed to hotwire a truck, ram a police roadblock, and then after a high-speed chase, ended up driving the truck into someone's living room. They were really upset, he later said about the people whose house he'd driven into. He had hundreds of disciplinary reports, but he's never hurt anyone else. They were usually for minor infractions, or for being found with weapons he was keeping to protect himself in the ultra-violent places where he was housed. His story became public, and the majority of the public now say that this is a man who has some mental issues, who's been chewed up by the prison system right from the first year when he was brutally beaten and sexually abused by a gang of inmates. He was paroled on February 5, 2019 on the condition that he spend a year in a mental health and substance abuse center. Over the years, he developed dependencies on the many drugs he received in prison. After only a few days, he started showing signs of bipolar mania, and his kidneys were failing him. He also tested positive for methamphetamine. Mark was subsequently sent back to jail, and from what we can now see, he is waiting to see which prison he'll be sent to. It's now 40 years since he drove off with his deceased father's tools. 27 of those years he spent in solitary confinement, either with the absence of the sun or in total darkness. Prison, the final frontier for some, a place where they end their days. Others will get to leave, but they'd wish they'd never stepped foot inside. Here are 50 things nobody tells you about prison. Number 50. We'll start with the USA, the country that can claim to lock more of its citizens up than any other, and by a long way too. According to 2020 data, there were 2.3 million US citizens behind bars. But when we say bars, that includes federal and state prisons, jails, juvenile correctional facilities, and immigration detention facilities. Just so you know, these numbers are not exactly stable, but close. People enter and leave facilities all the time. Number 49. It works out to around 639 people behind bars for every 100,000 people. The US is still number 1 in per capita terms. Here are the countries that follow up in the top 10. The number is per 100,000. El Salvador, 562. Turkmenistan, 552. Palau, 552. Rwanda, 511. Cuba, 510. Maldives, 449. Virgin Islands, UK, 447. Thailand, 443. The Bahamas, 442. Let's stick with numbers for now. We'll get around to the messed up stories soon. We promise. Number 48. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, in the US, 600,000 people enter prison every year, but that's nothing compared to jail. Around 10.6 million Americans enter jail every year. If you're wondering why that number is so high, it's because many people get out of jail very quickly once they've got bail. Some of them already have been convicted for small crimes, so stay there for a while. They number around 160,000 people a year. 1/4 of people who go to jail will be there again after release within a year. Another reason for staying in jail is the simple fact that many poor people can't afford to make bail. In 2019, the Chicago Tribune wrote that of the 5,736 inmates in Cook County Jail, 5,390 were waiting for a trial. Half of them couldn't afford to pay bail, or they didn't have a place to stay where they could be electronically monitored. That begs the question, how many are innocent? Number 47. It's hard to say because statisticians tell us that a person is 9 times more likely to say they are guilty of a misdemeanor crime if they can't make bail. They just want to move things on, even if they're innocent. In fact, 95% of cases never go to trial. People take plea bargains, sometimes if they're innocent. That doesn't mean prisons are teeming with innocent people, but quite a few people have been wrongly convicted of a crime. The Innocence Project says it's between 2.3% and 5% of prisoners in the US. Other sources put it as high as 10%. But why? Number 46. The answer is for many reasons. Some innocent people take a plea, especially if they think they have a less than great lawyer and they've been convinced that if the case goes to trial, they're looking at a hefty prison sentence. In court, an innocent person could lose because of prosecutorial misconduct, or because a witness lied, or even a cop lied. Maybe during the interrogation, the police were somewhat heavy-handed and the victim was overwhelmed. Let's now look at an extreme case when this happened. Number 45. We've picked on the US enough for now, so now we'll sail across the pond to the UK. In 1974, a 17-year-old council worker named Stephen Downing confessed to murdering a 32-year-old woman named Wendy Sewell. The case would become known as the greatest miscarriage of justice the UK had ever seen, although that's questionable given witches were burned there. Anyway, this young lad first told cops he found the woman at the cemetery where he was working as a groundskeeper. He said he moved her body and that's why he got blood on him. He was interrogated for 9 long hours. He also had learning difficulties, and there wasn't any lawyer with him during the questioning. Guess what? At the end of the grueling interrogation, he'd said he'd done it. He was given a long sentence with the condition that he could meet with a parole board after 10 years. Inmates believed this guy had hurt a woman, so he was beaten badly and he had to change prisons 8 times. Later, he was caught in something called the innocent prisoner's dilemma. He couldn't be paroled because he refused to say he committed the crime. Talk about a catch-22. It's actually not that uncommon. We won't get too much into it, but the whole case was shambles. He should have never been sent to prison. The cops knew this. One journalist that tried to help Downing told the BBC that the police harassed him. He said, "They made my life absolute hell for 5 or 6 years. I was pulled over for speeding, stopped and searched, victimized. I was very worried for my family." Downing got out after 27 years, and subsequent investigations found that the police in the past had done some very sketchy work indeed. On release, he received around $1 million in compensation and became a chef. He told the press, "I never allowed myself to feel angry or bitter. Who could I have taken it out on anyway? I still refuse to." Number 44. The vast majority of prisoners in the US are not in for violent offenses. We looked at the latest 2021 data from the US Bureau of Prisons and saw that 46.2% of prisoners were in for drug offenses. No other crime came close. Although offenses relating to weapons, explosives, and arson accounted for 20.2% of prisoners. Every 25 seconds, someone is arrested for drug possession in the US, although they don't all end in prison, of course. Number 43. We looked into drug possession offenses, and it is a very, very contentious issue. One reason is that drugs are widely available in prisons. In fact, there are reports stating that people have gone in for possessing soft drugs and got addicted to hard drugs inside to deal with the mental issues they faced. The vast majority of prisoners in for drugs are not trafficking drug kingpins, they're merely addicts. Research shows that importers or high-level suppliers only amount to 11% of drug offenders doing hard time. On top of that, there's ample data to suggest that more poor people get stopped by cops and more of them go to prison for drug offenses than middle-class or wealthy people. As the Marshall Project said, rich drug abusers go to treatment, not prison. The UK Guardian echoed that, saying, "The wealthy make mistakes, the poor go to jail." The story said you're much more likely to have a drug problem if you've suffered trauma growing up or grown up poor. Prison is like a double whammy. Pew Research said this: more imprisonment does not reduce state drug problems. Pew discovered that the deterrent of prison hasn't and doesn't stop people from taking drugs. This is why this is one very big hot potato of a subject. Okay, enough of that. Who served the most time ever? Number 42. We found a few names. Paul Geidel served 68 years in the US after being convicted of second-degree murder in 1911. Weird thing is, it's looking like a parole board might have released him in 1926 because of his good behavior, but then he was found to be legally insane. He could have gotten out after 63 years, but by then he was so institutionalized that he chose to stay in another 5 years. He died a free man in 1987, aged 93. Number 41. Francis Clifford Smith served over 71 years in prison for the murder of a night watchman in 1950 in Connecticut. In 2020, he was moved to a nursing home. Now you'll see how innocent men can spend many years behind bars. Number 40. In 1972, age 26, Richard Phillips went to prison an innocent man. He was released 46 years later. He wrote this poem a few years into his incarceration. "Ain't it a crime when you don't have a dime to buy back the freedom you've lost? Ain't it odd that when you pray to God, your prayers don't seem to be heard? Ain't it sad when you've never had the freedom of a soaring bird?" He was finally exonerated in 2018 and later told he received $1.5 million in compensation. He told the media, "I just want to keep a low profile, travel, and enjoy life. That's what I've wanted to do in the first place." Number 39. In a paper titled Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, it was said that 4% of people in the US on death row are probably innocent in the past and right now. Number 38. 18 people in the US have gotten off death row after DNA testing proved that they were innocent. They had collectively served 229 years. Sometimes innocent people get executed too, as you'll now see. Number 37. A U.S. man named Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in 2004, and later his innocence was proved after the case was said to have been heavily flawed. His last words were, "The only statement I want to make is that I'm an innocent man, convicted of a crime I did not commit." This is what an investigator later said. The whole case was based on the purest form of junk science. Johnny Garrett was executed in the U.S. in 1992, and later DNA evidence proved he was innocent. It said he didn't want to share any last words, although some sources say he said, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. The rest of the world can kiss my..." We omitted one word. When innocent Florida man Jesse DeFaro was executed in 1990, Old Sparky malfunctioned, and witnesses said what they saw was pure horror. The South Florida Sun-Sentinel wrote, "Flames and smoke erupted from his head. Now you'll see that executions of innocent people don't only happen in the USA." Number 36. In Russia in 1983, a man named Alexander Kravchenko was executed for murder. Turns out that the killer was none other than the butcher of Rostov, Andrei Chikatilo. In 1950, a man named George Kelly was hanged in the UK for murder. There had been unbelievable police corruption in the case. The cops basically set him up. In fact, police had the confession of another man, but since they'd made a mess of the case, they held that information back. In 1989, a man named Tang Jingxiang was executed in China for the murder of a woman. That woman later turned up to the surprise of everyone. Jingxiang had committed no crime at all. Number 35. Prisoners get drunk while locked up on alcohol they make themselves. It's sometimes called hooch or pruno, or prison wine. The best brewers can earn okay money from selling it. One former prisoner said, "You can sell half a gallon of wine for $25. Each pant leg makes 2.5 gallons, so you do the math. It's a good hustle." He said he cut pant legs and sewed the bottoms and lined them with plastic bags. Then he filled them with water. After that, he threw in 5 pounds of sugar, loaded diced tomatoes, and tomato paste. He then let that all ferment. Other prisoners have used bread for yeast. As for the sweetness, any kind of fruit works, but you can also add candy. It's important to burp the bag. We saw a guy in a podcast who said he'd forgotten to do that, and he got covered in the stuff when it exploded. Number 34. Another thing prisoners will pay good money for is mobile phones. It's not easy getting them in. Sometimes an officer can be tempted with cash or even threatened. Other times the phones are plugged in the rear, which you can imagine can be quite uncomfortable. For a run-of-the-mill phone, you might be able to charge $1,000 US inside prison. Number 33. In 2015, Brazilian prison officers discovered a unique way prisoners were getting phones inside. They used cats. One cat that frequently went in and out of the prison was found with 4 mobile phones, 4 chargers, and 7 cards attached to it. Number 32. Just how much a man can plug is anyone's guess, but we saw a documentary where an officer showed how a prisoner had plugged a foldable knife. The British Prime Minister was recently given a lesson on such acts when he learned some British prisoners were hiding Kinder eggs in themselves filled with drugs. Number 31. Why would people go to such an effort, you might ask? The answer is the markup. Drugs in prison are way more expensive than on the outside. So much so, officers might sometimes get in on the dealing. It's a license to print money, and there's no shortage of prisoners wanting something to take the monotony away. In fact, because opiates can't be detected in urine around 2 to 3 days later, some prisoners get into them even though they just wanted to smoke weed. Weed can be detected up to 21 days after ingestion. One podcast we watched said he took opiates in prison, but every so often he got caught out. He said then he went back to the first floor where he had no privileges. He'd slowly go back to the upper floor where he'd do more opiates, then he got caught again and was sent back down. He called it the merry-go-round. Number 30. Even tobacco is expensive inside. One prisoner said he was getting stuff brought in, and then he charged $2 or $3 for just one small rolled cigarette. That meant that one pouch cheap outside of prison was worth a lot of money. In 2020, in an Irish prison, officers discovered one haul that included mobile phones, 800 grams of weed, 2 grams of cocaine, and 10,000 pills. To give you an idea of how much that's worth, we'll go to another news story that said in the UK in just 2017, 15,000 phones and a massive 189 kilos of drugs were confiscated. A phone in a UK prison might go for $300 to $1,300, and those are low-quality devices. The same article said synthetic drug called Spice can cost over 30 times more in prison than on the outside. Cocaine, depending on the quality, might cost $100 on the outside for a gram. That might go for $1,000 on the inside. The markup was even higher for a gram of heroin. This is why some people put eggs in their behind. Number 29. Another way to get stuff in is when violent cons groom officers. That happened to a man named Lee Davies in England. He was on incredibly low pay for such a stressful job, and then he helped some gang members get phones and drugs inside. His money problems were over. He was told to wait in a car park someplace, then a car would pull up and throw something into his car. He then smuggled the package inside, and he kept doing that for months. He was eventually caught. He said later, "There's no excuse for what I did, but I have deep sympathy for people working in that environment." He believes he was partly groomed by the prisoners. Number 28. He started on £20,000 a year, or $27,000. That's a very low wage, but the job has got to be one of the hardest you could do. According to job websites, a starting prison officer's wage might be $31,740 a year in the US. Overstressed and underpaid is what you hear from most officers. They're dealing with violence and outrage, and sometimes severe mental issues, almost on a daily basis. Number 27. Then there's what's called the prison industrial complex. Mass incarceration has become a business, one that is booming in the U.S. The American Civil Liberties Union says mandatory minimum sentences helped create the U.S.'s bursting prisons. And on top of that, there was the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This led to more mass incarceration and massive profits for the private prison industry. There are many kinds of businesses that make money, not just private prisons. You have the food services, handcuff makers, clothes services, and the ones earning from cheap prison labor, and much more. This is how one person put it. The prison industrial complex is not only a set of interest groups and institutions, it's a state of mind. The lure of big money is corrupting the nation's criminal justice system, replacing notions of safety and public service with a drive for higher profits. Number 26. These are some companies benefiting or that benefited from cheap prison labor in the U.S. McDonald's, Walmart, Microsoft, IBM, Target, Intel, Victoria's Secret, yeah, they make lingerie, Honda, Starbucks, Nike, Nintendo. Number 25. If you want to know how much the prisoners make, NPR interviewed a guy that worked at Omaha Correctional Center after getting 8 to 16 years for theft and forgery. He was paid $2.25 a day for a 12-hour shift, but he also said one phone call cost him $5 and a bag of chips also cost him $5. Number 24. For some regular prison work in some prisons, you get nothing. Just getting out of your cell is payment. Prison policy said in Florida, if you're laboring for state-owned industries, you can earn between 20 cents and 55 cents an hour. That seems to be about the going wage. Now for some more prison violence. Number 23. Not surprisingly, prisoners get killed in prison. Gang violence is usually to blame, or at times people are killed for a certain crime they committed on the outside, or someone just gets killed over an argument. In 2008, there were only 40 homicides in U.S. prisons. That number pretty much increased every year. In 2020, the last data we could find, the number was 120. As you'll now see, violence inside the prison is much worse in other countries. Number 22. We looked at prisons and jails in Ecuador and what's been going on in 2021. In February, the BBC reported that 79 people were murdered in 4 different Ecuadorian jails, although they were related to the same gang squabbles. In April, the BBC reported 5 men were murdered and 16 injured in just one Ecuadorian prison, again gang-related. In July, Al Jazeera wrote that 22 men were murdered and many others were injured in 2 prisons in that country. Gang rivalry was to blame, but overcrowding and bad conditions was also mentioned. After that, Ecuador's president declared a state of emergency. Number 21. Okay, so you've all seen the movies that suggest in some US prisons you have to join a gang or you'll either get beaten or exploited. Really, do convicted accountants end up putting in work for the Sureños? It's actually a complex question, but we guess the best people to answer it are folks who've done a lot of prison time. There's no shortage of those people, who now have their own YouTube channel. People say it depends on where you're doing your time, but it might not mean you have to get involved with a gang. Most prisoners give the advice, just keep your head down and do your time. They usually agree on one thing though, and that is you will likely at least need alliances. A British stockbroker agreed. He had the bad idea of starting an ecstasy empire after moving to the US. After being locked up in Arizona, he said the first thing that happened scared the hell out of him. Gang members came into his cell and asked for his papers. He didn't know what that meant. They actually wanted to see what he'd been convicted of to make sure he hadn't hurt society's most vulnerable. In some prisons, that could mean KOS, or kill on sight. It's why some prisoners are housed in protective custody. After he was deemed okay, he said he didn't join a gang, but he also said he made some friends. That made his life much easier. One former prisoner in the US said this: "The commonly held belief that joining a gang is the only way to survive prison is one that I sincerely wish would forever go the way of the dodo. I honestly think it's the gangs themselves that try their hardest to propagate this false notion." Another guy agreed, but he said hanging with your own race in some prisons is a must. He also said this: "In the yard, all the races hang with their own. With the gangs and shot callers, they may take advantage of the weaker ones, making them pay rent and such. But once you stand up for yourself, they'll usually stop and often ask you to join the gang. If you say no, they usually accept it. So no, you won't have to join a gang, but as you'll now see, you also won't be completely independent." Number 20. There's the dining room or chow hall. If you don't get told where to sit by officers, you'll sit with your own race. This is where it helps to have made friends. You certainly have to show respect, so just plonking your behind down without thinking about it will lead to you getting a bust head. One prisoner said at his prison there was what he called short bus tables. These were the tables where anyone could sit, but he said they were reserved for the less respected prisoners. Most former prisoners agree on one thing: it's in the chow hall where you see alliances. Even if you're a fiercely independent person, some former prisoners say going it alone is not recommended. Number 19. In the UK, race doesn't matter all that much. You usually hook up with friends, and if you're a longtime criminal, you'll likely have some. If there are gang rivalries, it's not about the color of your skin, but where you come from. In London or Liverpool, there have been what the media called postcode wars. In some podcasts, former British prisoners from the South said they didn't like getting sent to the northern part of the country and vice versa. Number 18. If you do get attacked in prison, it's sometimes with a homemade knife or shiv. Sometimes it's just with a razor blade. Other times the instrument will have a few razor blades attached close to each other. This is so the wound is almost impossible to stitch. The British media has reported a lot on this. Apparently the wound leaves a really big scar. That's bad, but this is worse. Number 17. One of the most horrendous things prisoners do, and it seems it's not all that uncommon, is throw boiling water in someone's face. They'll usually fill the water with sugar because that makes the water caramelized and sticky. In the past, in the UK, this has been referred to as napalm. After that, you need some good advice. Number 16. Prisoners often talk about the prison code, which, to be frank, sounds hypocritical and nonsensical a lot of the time. Still, there are some do's and don'ts the prisoners talk about. Do: keep your head down. Be polite and respectful as much as possible. If you're picked on or attacked, fight back even if you're the lamest fighter in the world. Develop an exercise routine. Study the lay of the land. Educate yourself when something is available. Choose your friends carefully. Maintain good personal hygiene. Don't act tough. Now you're nobody. Gamble. Take drugs. Borrow stuff, even if someone seems really kind. Judge people. Steal. Stare. Talk to everyone about your crime. Fart, if you can help it. Snitch. Number 15. Sometimes inmates locked in their cells create what are called biological projectile weapons. These are to spray officers with urine, feces, or even bile. Just in California, at 3 prisons, there were 111 gassing attacks in 2017. In that state, you get 5 years in segregation for gassing an officer. Number 14. Prisoners sometimes use coded letters to get messages to each other, which might look innocuous, but if you can decode the message, something darker lurks between the words. In 2018, a letter sent from a prisoner to the outside that didn't say anything out of the ordinary was an order to kill a staff member in the Atlanta jail. You just had to read between the lines. Other times, prisoners create their own ciphers, with symbols designating a letter of the alphabet. A gang expert who specializes in breaking codes said about this: "Not knowing what a code says can give us nightmares. We need to know what these gang codes say, but sometimes we need to know what they don't say even more." Number 13. Perhaps one of the strangest things to happen in a woman's prison is someone gets pregnant when they have never had a conjugal visit, like a private visit with a lover or spouse. That happened in 2019. A woman had been behind bars for a year and a half, waiting to be sentenced for capital murder when she had a baby. She'd been charged with being the getaway driver when an elderly man was shot and killed. It later transpired that she'd somehow conspired to get pregnant by sleeping with a male inmate working at the prison. News reports said she hoped to having a new child would sway the judge to grant her some leniency. This next one is heartbreaking. Number 12. The youngest prisoner ever to sit on death row was George Julius Stinney Jr. This African-American boy was arrested in June 1944, charged with killing 2 people. In June, he was executed in the electric chair, and he was so small that a Bible had to be propped under him on the chair. The investigation was an absolute travesty of justice, and the jury that sentenced him was all white. The grave he was buried in was unmarked. In 2014, the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project said this: "There is compelling evidence that George Stinney was innocent of the crimes for which he was executed in 1944. There wasn't any substantial evidence to support his guilt, and his defense lawyer was less than useless. In fact, he had no support at all. It was a kid against the racist cops and indeed the racist justice system." The real murderer of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames got away. His conviction was overturned in 2014. Number 11. The oldest person executed was Walter Moody. He died by lethal injection in Alabama in 2018. He'd been convicted of killing a judge with a mail bomb in 1989. Number 10. Prison is supposed to rehabilitate. That's why it's there. But often those that go in again. Officers sometimes call the prison gates a revolving door. It's hard to compare recidivism rates worldwide because you have to choose certain years to conduct the study, and there's a lot of data from all over the world. The U.S. National Institutes of Health did a study, but the data was from different years regarding different countries. Nonetheless, it found that the percentage of released prisoners that were arrested for another crime within 2 years in England and Wales was 48%. In France, it was 40%. In Finland, it was 36%. In Norway, it was 20%. In Australia, it was 53%. And in the U.S., it was 60%. Number 9. The U.S. Supreme Court in 2011 called California's recidivism rates stratospherically high. It was said then that a whopping 70% of released prisoners in that state were back behind bars within 3 years. The state's prisons were accused of not rehabilitating but producing additional criminal behavior. That's why prisons are sometimes called crime school. It's hard to fully understand why people end up back in prison, but parole violations and habitual drug use, as well as falling back into poverty and hopelessness, count for something. Critics have said U.S. and other countries' prisons focus a lot more on punishment rather than rehab, which is the opposite of the Norwegian model. As you know, that country has very low recidivism rates. Okay, we think you need to hear some good news. Well, it's kind of positive. Number 8. A British guy named Stephen Akpabio Clementowski was locked up in England in 2002. While serving his 16-year sentence for drugs offenses, he earned a bachelor's degree and 2 master's degrees. He had 0 qualifications when he went in and started with his GCSEs and A-levels. That's equivalent to junior and senior high school. He worked in the kitchens all day and studied on the toilet at night, where he said it was quiet. He told The Guardian, "Sometimes I wondered how I did it. The idea that you can study in an environment designed for punishment is ridiculous." He said it wasn't easy studying in what he described as a hellish place. "I still have nightmares 10 years after leaving. It's a really damaging environment," he said. He's now a lecturer and a regional manager and spends a lot of time going back into prisons to help prisoners. While he did well locked up, he's still very critical of British justice. He doesn't believe prison acts as a deterrent to crime. He said people aren't being deterred. The number of people in prison has increased by 69% over the last 30 years. They're not being rehabilitated. Number 7. Anthony Ray Hinton spent close to 3 decades in isolation on death row in Alabama. He was exonerated in 2015. He's since written an award-winning book, The Sun Does Shine: How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row, and was awarded an honorary degree. Now you'll hear about a man who's more locked up than anyone else. Number 6. The British man who spent the longest time in prison is Robert Maudsley. He's been locked away since 1974, but for the last 25 years, he's been in the worst prison cell in the whole of England. He killed 3 men while in prison, and one of those murders earned him the name the British Hannibal the Cannibal. It was a brutal murder, but not as bad as those British tabloids made it out to be. Now he's in a special cell which is underneath the prison. It has thick doors with bulletproof glass. Even when you open the doors, he's actually in a cage within the cell. He's allowed no contact at all with other prisoners. He gets out once a day for an hour, but has to have 6 guards around him at all times. They try not to make eye contact with him or speak to him. He once said, "I am left to stagnate, vegetate, and to regress, left to confront my solitary head-on with people who have eyes but don't see, and who have ears but don't hear, who have mouths but don't speak." Many people have called this inhumane. They know his story and feel sorry for him given his childhood and the nature of the offenses of the people he killed. We won't go into detail, but we think you can work it out. He's possibly the most locked up man in the world. He once said, "I feel like I'm buried alive." The prison wouldn't even allow him to have a pet budgie. Number 5. The polar opposite of this is Bolivia's San Pedro prison. It's more like a village than a prison. There are cells to rent, markets to shop in, and even tourists can visit. Prisoners make cash by selling cocaine paste to them. Wives and children can live with the prisoner. There's also a prison hotel, a soccer pitch, a few churches, and a hospital. Officers work there, but the prisoners themselves ensure bad things don't happen inside. If a prisoner does commit a crime, they are disciplined in, let's say, a very stern way. If they commit a very serious violent crime, they are likely dead soon after. Number 4. We think the biggest prison in the world has to be Turkey's Silivri prison. It spans over 250 acres and is home to more than 10,000 prisoners. Are Turkish prisons bad? Maybe they were in the 70s when hundreds of US citizens occupied them, mostly for smuggling that quality hashish they so loved. When Billy Hayes was a student, he was sent to one. He wrote a book on his release and it became the harrowing movie Midnight Express. He actually escaped in the end. He actually said the movie exaggerated a fair few things. The next country's prisons are bad, and no one denies it. Number 3. One prison with lots of Westerners serving hard time within its walls is Bangkok's Klong Prem prison. Many smugglers have lived there and felt what it's like to sleep with 60-odd men in a cell packed like sardines. One man actually holds a record there to this day. He's a British guy named David McMillan, a former big-time drug smuggler with a rather posh accent. He's the only Westerner ever to have escaped the prison. In prisons such as this, if you have money, you can live well. There's a kind of anarchy in there, and the guards take a piece of everything. McMillan had a personal cook, someone to do his laundry, and he had a cell with few people in it that had a TV. He even had a little office area. But when he heard he would be transferred to Bangkwang Central Prison, aka the Bangkok Hilton, he made a plan to escape. The Thais call this prison the Big Tiger because it eats men. Many that go in die there. McMillan successfully escaped, but the funny part is that once he got to the street, he opened an umbrella he'd taken with him. When asked why he did that, he said, "Escaping prisoners don't carry umbrellas." Number 2. One of the worst prison disasters we could find happened in the US at Ohio State Prison in 1930. There was a huge fire, except the guards wouldn't open the cell doors. One person described it like this: "There was nothing to do but scream for God to open the doors. And when the doors didn't open, all that was left was to stand still and let the fire burn the meat off and hope it wouldn't be too long about it." Some prisoners managed to overpower the guards, but outside those cells they were given orders to shoot and kill. One prisoner later said, "Naturally, all of those men were in there and hollering and screaming for help, and some of the men were praying, and some of them was cussing, and some of them were raving. It was a question to do what you could do to help them." 322 inmates died from the fire or smoke inhalation, and another 230 had to be hospitalized. Okay, let's finish on a positive note. Number 1. There's a prison in Finland called Suomenlinna Prison. The prison walls are actually just a small fence. In the past, it has had problems with prisoners not trying to break out, but people trying to sneak in. The cells are like nice dorm rooms, and the shared kitchens all have the modern appliances you can ask for. Some prisoners are in there for the most serious offenses, but they go to this prison when their term is close to an end. It's kind of like finishing school, the halfway house before prisoners enter society at large. Still, they do their last few years there even though they could easily just walk out. Why, might you wonder? A prison official said this: "The main idea here is to prepare the inmates for release into the community. It doesn't make sense for an inmate to be in a closed prison for say 6 years and to suddenly enter civilian life. We also offer rehabilitation for people who have had problems related to alcohol, drugs, or mental illness."
Day of the escape. He takes a pencil from behind his ear and underlines a passage in his prison-issue Bible, Genesis 9:5-6. "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed." He doesn't yet know it, but these words are going to come back to haunt him. All he's known in his life is violence. From being a young victim to adult perpetrator, he's killed and he'll kill again if anyone tries to get in the way of his escape. He and his accomplice, a man no stranger to extreme violence himself, will do something that's unheard of in the annals of American incarceration. Shawshank Redemption has nothing on these guys. Tomorrow, June 6, 2015 at 5:17 a.m., both of these men will be discovered missing from their cells at New York State's Clinton Correctional Facility. This is a huge complex of sprawling buildings first opened in the mid-1800s that once served as a notorious insane asylum. Among the criminal fraternity, it's sometimes called Little Siberia, due to the freezing winters and the fact it's surrounded by miles and miles of rugged wilderness. A good place to get lost if you're a criminal, but a harsh place to try to survive. The authorities will find a cheeky note left for them, a slap in the face if there ever was one. Down a tunnel, another note reads, "You left me no choice but to grow old and die in here. I had to do something." On a picture of Tony Soprano that the escapee has painted himself, he's written, "Time to go, kid, 6/5/15." No one was supposed to be able to escape from this maximum security fortress. No one ever has escaped. The authorities can't believe what they're seeing. They now know that they've underestimated these two uneducated felons, cold-hearted killers as cunning and vengeful as Greek gods.
Millions of dollars will be spent trying to catch them, but suffice to say they ain't intending to live behind bars again. They're armed and dangerous, and they're heading to the border. Their names are David Sweat and Richard Matt, and this is the story of their truly outstanding escape. This is how it all starts. Day 1. Matt and Sweat have just started working together in one of the prison tailor workshops. Around 400 guys in Clinton make inmate clothes and other tailored stuff, such as lab coats and sweatshirts. They get 25 to 50 cents an hour. It's not much, but the job passes the time. Matt is known throughout the prison as Hacksaw. He's both respected and feared. Feared because of the fact that he got his nickname from dismembering a man. Respected because he'd do it again, but warn you first. Weeks 1 through 6. Outside of crime, these two men have another skill, the art of flirtation. And as luck would have it, the object of their flirtation is a civilian female supervisor who loves the attention of the men she supervises. Her name is Joyce Tilly Mitchell. She isn't exactly easy on the eye, and she knows it, which makes her vulnerable to all the guys she's supposed to watch over. On top of this, her relationship with her husband lacks any sort of passion. He's Lyle, and he's a bright star in the story of lies and deception. He's a good person, in a tale full of bad people. He'll get a hit put on his head from a place that he least expects. When Sweat and Matt flirt with Mitchell, she can't help but giggle and blush. The first to really go after her is Sweat, who occasionally flashes naughty winks and smiles at her as he's sewing his clothes together on his machine. It should be said that Mitchell has been accused before of improper conduct with inmates, including Sweat, but as you'll see, she's really good at getting away with things. This is why she's fine with flirting with Sweat again, only this time she'll take things much further. Sweat has the instructor's job and Matt a regular machinist's job. Good friends, their machines are side by side. All day they plan and conspire and stare over at Mitchell. Both these guys have been designated as a central monitoring case, meaning great care should be taken to watch them. Sweat falls into this category just because of the sheer brutality of his crime. The reason Matt is monitored is that he's an escape risk as well as a brute. He's escaped from another prison in the past. A document relating to him reads, "All necessary precautions should be taken whenever it's required to move the inmate outside the facility regardless of the reason." So despite having some very sketchy backgrounds and not having great prison records, they are allowed to work in the tailor shop. Lately, they've had quite a good run in terms of staying out of trouble, so both have a cell on what's called the honor block. Here, there are 180 prisoners and 174 cells. Security is just the same here, or should be, but the inmates are at least allowed to wear some civilian clothes, have much more time to hang out with other inmates in the recreational areas, as well as getting a bunch of other privileges. This will all help Sweat and Matt. Sweat's described by another inmate as being very, very self-sufficient in all ways. He's clever and he's resourceful. He's even a bit of a survivalist. Matt is the chatty one, described as sociable and gregarious. He's also tough and can back up his fierce reputation if need be. He's a survivor, but far from being a survivalist. He's in his late 40s and Sweat's in his early 30s. It's Matt who introduces Sweat to one of the wonders of painting, a hobby they'll both employ as a means to escape, and one in which Matt shows considerable talent. Weeks 12 through 17. It's now plain to see for the other inmates in the workshop that Sweat and Mitchell have got something going on. It becomes more obvious when, after a while, she starts going to the stock room with him. Mitchell comes out looking all flustered and red in the cheeks. The inmates know exactly what's going on, but one of the guards in the workshop's more interested in reading his book than watching out for inmate-supervisor relationships. Weeks 18 to 25. She gets reported for treating the inmates like friends and being way too close to some of them. Mitchell fires back, complaining that she feels she's being harassed for no reason. She then files a grievance, and to be honest, the prison doesn't want the hassle, so she keeps up her job. Let's now introduce another main character to the story. He's Correction Officer Eugene Palmer, a man who's been at Clinton for 27 years. He's the go-to guard for inmates when they have a problem, and he and Matt are described as being two peas in a pod. They've been close, too close, for years now. If Sweat's working on Mitchell during the day, then Matt has Palmer in the palm of his hand on the honor block. It's ideal for the pair. It makes life easy, but at the start, they don't realize it also provides a means to escape. Matt often gives his paintings to Palmer, who's impressed with the artwork. He's especially impressed when Matt gives him paintings and sketches of his own family and house, which he does on a few occasions over the years, and he works really hard at completing them. The better the work, the more favors come Matt's way. When Palmer starts dating Clinton Correctional Officer Mary Lamar, he even commissions Matt to do a bunch of paintings of Lamar's family. One day she starts crying outside Matt's cell when he gives her the finished piece. She can't believe how amazing it is. Palmer is made up. He's made this woman happy and he owes Matt big time. Matt also informs Palmer when violence is about to happen. One day they both walk into a quiet corner and Matt warns, "You're going to lose your prison. It's a powder keg. It's about to explode." My informant tells me that when it goes, they're going to show no mercy.
For this, both Matt and Sweat enjoy the best conditions in the block, receiving TVs from Palmer and as many painting supplies as they want, in spite of the fact that a paintbrush can be used for all kinds of wicked purposes. But more importantly, when Palmer escorts these guys back to the block from the workshop, he sometimes takes them a way in which they don't have to pass through any metal detectors. This is foolhardy to say the least, especially when you find out what kinds of things Mitchell is giving them in the workshop. Weeks 26 through 29. Things are about to change. The prison authorities receive an anonymous letter. It states Sweat and the workshop supervisor Mitchell are having inappropriate relations, and it's damn obvious to everyone. In the storeroom, says the letter, the two bang like beavers. The complaint even says that Mitchell is always doing favors for the white guys, but she's always on the backs of Latinos and blacks. Further down, the letter states it's funny that she goes to the next door with the same guy once or twice a week for 3 to 5 minutes and comes out with nothing. I've noticed that since I started working here in the past 5 months. In short, Mitchell is furious and denies everything, but in the end, Sweat gets 30 days on the punishment block without privileges and is taken out of the workshop for security concerns. That's when he's told he'll be moving into a cell away from his buddy Matt. He loses his place on the honor block and now has no way of making money. This will play a big part in his wanting to escape. Mitchell's outrage and the tsunami of complaints she sends to the warden go a long way to help keeping her job. The prison doesn't dare bring charges against her knowing that she'll kick up a stink about harassing a female. But she's more upset about losing the love of her life. She even cries in front of some of the other inmates. She's lost the man she believes really understands her, cares for her, and she's also lost the best damn machinist she's ever had. Suffice to say, things go really downhill in the workshop after Sweat is gone. Weeks 30 to 51. Matt asks Palmer to help make him the workshop supervisor, and Palmer does it. Now Mitchell's special little helper is Sweat's best friend, and if any other inmates complain, he'll get them thrown out of the workshop. She's also quite attracted to Matt, who, it has to be said, has a way with women. He makes me feel special, Mitchell secretly tells one of her friends. He just understands me. I still haven't gotten over David, but there's just something about Richard. I don't know. He just listens. Matt is by far the better manipulator, even if it's Sweat that has a high IQ. In no time at all, Mitchell is breaking all the rules for him. One time buying him a $9 pair of reading glasses on eBay. This is about as big a transgression as you can get, but for the time being, their relationship is not sexual. For her efforts, Matt paints her a picture of her son, an 11 by 16-inch work that she's overjoyed with. Such a thing isn't easy to pass to someone in prison, so Palmer takes it from Matt, then drops it off in Mitchell's car. Since Palmer has all those years behind him, no one at the gate asks him what's in the package he now has that he didn't come in with. This is how lax things are. Week 52. Matt tells Mitchell he really needs a pair of gloves as his hands are hurting when he works out. Can she buy him some, he asks, telling her he's only too happy to paint something else for her. She says. Can you do dogs? Sure, Matt says. Dogs aren't a problem. Week 53. Mitchell breaks the rules even more times, once calling Matt's daughter for him and passing on a message. It's at this point that Matt is thinking this love-struck woman will do absolutely anything for him. Meanwhile, even her husband Lyle knows she's been helping Matt and receiving these paintings in return. Lyle tells her one night, "This ain't worth losing your job over, darling. They're nice paintings, but this could get you in serious trouble. He can snitch on Palmer if he wants, but there's one thing you don't do in prison, and that's tell on someone even if you're a guard." Weeks 54 to 55. Mitchell keeps smuggling stuff in, including 70 containers of black and cayenne pepper, 10 10-ounce packages of Cafe Bustelo coffee, several decks of playing cards, and numerous other prohibited items. It's at this point that Sweat's busy brain gets going. Still irked about losing his cushy job, one day he turns to Matt and says, "I just want to get out of this place. I want to be free. I want to go live somewhere away from everybody." He then says, if Mitchell will get you anything, why not ask her to bring stuff in we can use to escape? He says the gloves and the glasses will already come in handy, but they can do even better than that. "We have the ideal situation right now," he tells Matt. "Do you think she'll be up for it?" Matt laughs and says, "She's freaking nuts. She'll bring us whatever she wants. Just tell me what you need and I'll get her to bring it in." Sweat envisions getting through his cell door by exploiting a vulnerability in the locking system, and then walking to the yard where he'll use his new tools to get a rope over the wall. He tells Matt he needs a star-headed screw bit and some putty, and later Mitchell doesn't let him down. Matt tells her these things are for his art and the frames he'll make. Week 56 through 59. Sweat changes his mind and says to Matt, "What about getting through the sewer system?" He says for this they'll have to be in cells next to each other. He explains that they'll saw through the wall, get into the tunnels he thinks are back there. Matt asks for another favor from Palmer. Can he help get Sweat back into the tailor shop? Not necessarily his tailor shop, but any of them. If this happens, it'll mean Sweat gets a cell back in the honor block. Palmer does as he's asked, and stage 1 of the plan is complete. Week 60. Sweat is now working in the workshop 8. Matt is working not too far away in another shop. Mitchell occasionally now sees Sweat as they pass each other in the corridor.
Each time she smiles and surreptitiously gives his hand a little squeeze. This mother and wife, who's old enough to be his mother, is acting like a love-struck teenager. For the time being, she had no idea about any escape plan, but she's more than willing to bring stuff in for Sweat and Matt. Week 61. Sweat is now in cell A623, right next to Matt in cell A622. He was assigned another cell on the block, but has paid the guy in A623 $100 worth of smokes and given him some homemade pornography books. Sweat says to Matt, "We need saws, hacksaw blades, that's what you need Tilly to bring in, as many as possible." 5 hours later, Mitchell is at a Walmart store close to her house, handing over $6 for a bunch of hacksaw blades. She uses cash even though she's already used her credit card to buy other items. The next day, she places them at the side of Matt's workstation. Back in the cells, Matt gives 3 of them to Sweat. It's time to do some sawing. During the evening, they both use the blades to start cutting a 10 by 10 inch hole through the 3/16 inch thick rear steel wall. As handles for the blades, they use rubber bands wrapped around cloth. To prevent any noise when they move the heavy table away from the wall, they put tape under the table legs. The sound of the sawing is also obscured, much thanks to the general din of a prison and the fact that every evening guys slam dominoes down on tables. They've sawn their first tiny hole. Success! There are air vents and attached ducts behind the wall, which will also have to be sawn through in time. The little bits of filings will be picked up by magnets the guys have stolen from the workshop. Weeks 64 through 65. They do this every day from 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. when most of the other prisoners are in the mess hall or the recreation area. The officers are never suspicious. Sweat and Matt rarely eat in the mess hall, and during the evenings it's quite normal for them to paint in their cells. They only ever cut one at a time for 10 to 20 minutes, while the other uses a mirror to look down the landing for approaching guards. If a guard is seen, both men jump into their beds and pretend to be asleep or look like they're painting or listening to music. One day, Palmer almost catches them, but he's just come by to give them some more prison hooch, of which Matt drinks a ton. It takes Sweat 3 weeks to cut a hole that's 17 inches by 12.5 inches. For Matt, an 18.5 by 14.5 inch is complete in 4 weeks. The older, bigger man is always lagging behind, which in time to come will be a matter of life and death. Week 66. When Sweat's able to crawl through his hole, he starts leaving a dummy in his bed, so if the guards walk past his cell, they'll think he's sleeping. The dummy is hardly a work of art, and if those guards just paid any attention, they'd likely see it for what it was: a pair of stuffed pants and a prison-issue sweatshirt. Once Sweat's through a hole, he clips a painting against the outside with magnets he's stolen. Now he's free to explore. Week 67. One day, when he returns after his adventure, he tells Matt that he feels like a ninja. What freedom he has during these nights. But what he doesn't know is the hidden complexities of a giant prison. One night, Sweat manages to descend down 3 tiers. There he finds himself in a place that's littered with objects that have been thrown away over the years. Cigarette butts, bits of paper, styrofoam cups, and plastic bottles. After a bit of a walkabout, he gets to B block, just below the laundry building. This is progress. To get from B block to C block, he has to crawl through a steel pipe, and that pipe is blocked by a steel brace. Cutting this will not be easy at all. Even if he can, he's not sure if the heavyset Matt will be able to squeeze through the pipe. Luckily for them, Sweat has found a measuring tape on his nightly walks, so he can now measure the pipe and also Matt. Matt will be able to get through the pipe, but it won't be easy. Weeks 68 through 70. It takes Sweat 2 days to saw through the brace, only to become somewhat discouraged not to find the sewer system but some old boards in front of a great big cement wall. This is now turning into a mission of intense labor, but it's that or getting old in prison. He spends the next few nights shuffling around the subterranean maze of passageways under blocks C, D, and E, but he keeps hitting more cement walls. At least he's got tools and a nightlight, but he has to be careful. He's so close to the catwalk. Up above, he can see the guards walking around. One night, a discarded cigarette butt hits his head, and when he looks up, he sees a pair of officers' shoes. Just one wrong move and he's done. Sweat is so tired from these nightly jaunts that he never gets enough sleep. Each night after head count at 11:30, he leaves his cell, and he doesn't get back until 5:30 a.m. That's how much work he's doing, and he can hardly just sleep during the day. He has to work, and if he tries to sleep, someone will get suspicious. He looks so ragged that an officer remarks that Sweat's appearance has changed. "My God, what the hell's happened to him?" The officer tells another officer. "He looks as if he's been wrung through a knothole. He's so frail and exhausted." That's true. Sweat has lost 30 pounds since he started this exploration. Still, he is now fit as a fiddle, and this will bode well for him in the near future when he's on the run and has to turn into a veritable Iron Man. Week 71. Sweat now admits to himself that the only way to freedom is to take apart one of those cement walls. He starts removing 3 or 4 bricks a night out of the wall that is just 3 layers thick. He's basically dismantling a prison from the inside, which is why the authorities will be astounded in the time to come. As luck will have it, one day Sweat opens a contractor's gang box in a tunnel under E block. and inside is a gift from God, a sledgehammer. This won't be the last time he gets so lucky that he'll start thinking he has angels on his side. Let's just say here that he doesn't think he deserved to get such a long prison sentence. He thinks the sledgehammer is his good karma. Weeks 72 through 74. He has to do the wall smashing ever so delicately, only striking the bricks whenever the pipes start to moan and scream. Within 2 weeks, he's breached the wall. This is it. Now he's close to the outside. Or at least he thinks he is. After winding through yet more tunnels, he comes across his biggest obstacle yet. That's a 7-foot-thick son of a gun in the shape of a perimeter wall of the entire prison. At least he knows this is the last thing he has to get through. It's impossible. The wall's a huge block of cement that can only be knocked down with a machine. Even Matt joins him down there for a couple days when he's just too exhausted to do the work by himself. Matt's highly impressed with all the work Sweat's done. He looks at him and says, "Man, I can't believe you've done this. I've given up weeks ago." Matt's seen everything in his life. He's a career criminal who got involved seriously with crime at a young age. Later in life, a cop once described him as being the most vicious, evil person I've ever come across in 38 years as a police officer. Matt escaped from a care home for children when he was 12 by riding away on a horse. He stayed alone in the forest for 2 weeks. Even with his crazy existence of his, he thinks Sweat's tunnels are on another level. Still, Sweat cannot get through the wall. No amount of bashing with a sledgehammer will work. Now he has another idea. There's a steam pipe. Why not crawl through that? It's another tight space at just 24 inches and it's hot as hell, but Sweat thinks it's doable. Normally, you wouldn't be able to crawl through hot steam, but it's now May and the prison has just turned off its heating system. It'll still be warm in there and it's 20 feet long, but it can be done. Weeks 73 through 75. He struggles with the pipe, but after buying an extension cord from the prison commissary and rigging up some more lights, he knows he can take his time. He then returns to that gang box of tools, and inside is a power drill, a hammer, an angle grinder, battery packs, more lights, and even some masks for all the dust. Again, he puts this down to karma and the wrongs of America's justice system. He still needs more tools, so he tells Matt to tell Mitchell to buy 2 chisels, a steel punch, and some bits for the drill. Stuff they say they need for picture frames and other handiwork. This won't be easy to sneak in, but then Matt gets the idea for Mitchell to hide the bits in ground beef and then freeze the meat. If anyone asks, she'll say it's for the guys to make burgers. If anyone complains, well, that's harassment. She tells Matt she feels guilty about what she's been doing to her husband Lyle, as Lyle's arranging a surprise anniversary gift for her. One of Matt's paintings. She tries her hardest to stay out of his way. She now has a new word for Lyle, calling him a glitch in her life. Week 76. It's at this point that Matt tells her that he and Sweat are going to escape. That's why they've been asking for so many things. Sweat will be upset about Matt doing this, but Matt knows Mitchell won't breathe a word about it. She's attracted to Matt, but she hasn't given up on loving Sweat. Now she thinks if these guys leave, I've lost everything. She won't tell on them, but them going is something she doesn't want to think about. Matt can sense this, and for the first time he starts to get nervous. What if she does lose her cool and blabs? He talks to Sweat about it, and they come up with an idea. Weeks 77 and 78. Matt puts his arm around Mitchell's waist when they're in the storeroom and he whispers in her ear, "Why don't you come with us?" He tells her she can finally be rid of that useless husband and he and Sweat will take care of her. This manipulation goes a step further when Matt and Sweat agree that Sweat needs to confess his undying love for Mitchell. Matt starts passing her letters that Sweat has written, notes that talk about how much she misses her, and signs off with XOXOXO. "I want to feel myself inside of you," he writes, while he and Matt laugh out loud. And after this, she starts bringing in so many tools, Sweat's pipe cutting gets easier. In one letter, he writes, "I love you. Can't wait to get you in my arms and make love to you." Then at the bottom he writes, "P.S. I need some more of those drill bits, XOXOXO. All these notes are destroyed after reading, just as Matt's told her to do. Week 79. But Matt feels she still needs to be worked on more. One day he finds an opportunity to move things along when they're both together in a room next to Tailor Shop 9. Matt says he needs a machine part, but he doesn't really. He grabs her out of the blue and kisses her. For a moment she's taken aback, but man, is this guy strong. And he's so attractive. Still, she thinks, does he have to be so forceful? "You can love 2 people, you know," Matt says. "We both love you." This is a man with extreme violence toward women in his criminal history. His sweet words are tinged with so much darkness. Almost immediately it's arranged that she'll be the getaway driver once they're on the outside. And she'll have the car and she'll have food and money. As she's lying in bed with Lyle, ignoring his entreaties to have sex, she sees the 3 of them with a motorbike rental business somewhere on the coast of Mexico. The next day she goes out to buy some new underwear, sexier than her usual stuff. Poor Lyle thinks it's for him. Week 80. The inmates notice that Mitchell starts dressing nicer and suddenly she's losing lots of weight and doing her hair differently. During her lunch break she reads her new book, Madrigal's Magic Key to Spanish. What they don't know is that at home she's taking photos of herself naked and later handing them to Matt, so both he and Sweat can utilize them while they're alone in their cells. She's living a fantasy. Her photos are burned and certainly not used to facilitate orgasm. Matt tells her to buy black cargo pants for the escape. On the honor block, you have to wear prison-issue pants, even though you can have civilian tops. He tells her to get a tent, some sleeping bags, fishing poles, and a hatchet. Oh, he says, we'll also need one rifle, one shotgun, and a load of ammunition. Off she goes to the hardware store and later to the gas station to pick up a map of the local area and beyond. Matt and Sweat decide that at first, after escaping, they'll drive a few hours and rent a cabin up in the mountains in Vermont. Matt and Mitchell will pretend to be husband and wife, and Sweat will be the nephew. This plan changes pretty quickly after Matt says he has connections with the Mexican drug cartels, so if they get to Mexico, they'll have a safe place to hide before they head to the beach and start their new business. The plan suits everyone, but more so Matt, who has a tattoo on his body saying, Mexico forever. Week 81. Sweat tells Mitchell via a note handed to Matt that they should go scuba diving together once they're there, which almost brings tears to her eyes. As much as she's attracted to Matt, her future fantasy is with Sweat only. When that happens, Sweat will have already changed his name to James Tuttle, and Matt will be Tony Goya. That's the plan anyway. It's about this time that Matt makes a strange request. He asks Mitchell to smuggle in a bottle of Bacardi 151 and a bottle of wild turkey. Let's just say that Matt has had alcohol problems in the past, and as you'll soon find out, booze is going to play a big part in what happens to him. She does as is told, but draws the line when he asks her for a handgun, a micro knife, and a cell phone. You might now be wondering, what about Mitchell's ever-faithful husband? He adores his wife. He would chop off his right hand to keep her safe. Will she not miss him one bit? One day, Matt asks her about him, to which she replies with a snarl, "Oh, pop my husband. He's worth more to me dead than he is alive." She means it too. She tells the guys that on the night they leave, they should go to her house and shoot her husband dead with the gun she's bought for them. She's done with him. He's boring. He's a creep. And God knows she can't stand sharing a bed with him. She looks at Matt in all seriousness, as if she's thought about this a lot in the night, and says, "Or I'll drug him until he's passed out, and then we'll take the car and drive him off a cliff. At least that won't look like murder," she says. Even Matt, with his dark past, is thinking this woman is cold. Matt agrees, and Sweat also agrees, but they're both playing her. Still, Matt goes to the prison hospital and gets some pain medication for a nerve pain he has. He later passes them on to Mitchell and tells him to keep him in her purse until the big night. Week 82. It's almost time, and Sweat is just about done with the steam pipe. It's thick and it breaks a lot of blades, but 2 pounds of hamburger meat stuffed with blades saves the day again. Mitchell does the stuffing, but Palmer is the one who takes it out of the freezer and walks it to the block without going through the metal detectors. He has no idea what's in the meat though. The heat is now killing Sweat as he tries to cut the exit hole in the other end of the pipe. He again puts his brilliant mind into action and makes a ventilation system using the fan, a bunch of plastic bags, and a t-shirt. He fastens all the bags together to make a tube and connects them with rubber bands to the fan. And hey presto, he can now stay in the pipe for hours at a time. Week 84. Sweat pushes out the last bit of pipe. On the other side, he walks for a while until he sees a manhole. He then cuts the chain it's locked with using his hacksaw blades and pushes it out. It's his first taste of freedom in years. Looking over the street, he sees the local school, and boy does he grin a wide grin. He knows he's at the intersection of Barker Street and Box Street, and he knows the guards in the towers can't see this area. It's 4 in the morning and he thinks, right then man, I could just go now and have 90 minutes until they do morning roll call. But he puts an end to that thought and remembers he must stick to his word and get Matt out too. His loyalty might just be his downfall. When he gets back to his cell, even though he doesn't smoke, he lights a cigarette and uses a mirror to show Matt what he's doing. Matt whispers back, "Are you serious? Are you kidding me? You made it through?" Sweat takes a drag and replies, "No dude, I made it out twice, and I came back." They decide they'll go in the night. Sweat writes one last letter to Mitchell and it says, "Tonight's the night. Meet us at midnight. Park your car at the manhole in the intersection of Barker Street and Box Street. Leave it running, but turn off the headlights. Get out of the car and pretend you're on the phone. That way if anyone sees you, they won't become suspicious. See you soon, my love. XOXOXO. P.S. I can already see us swimming with manta rays." She doesn't know what a manta ray is, but it sounds exotic. The question is, can they rely on her? Sweat doesn't know that she's been stressed of late. A few days ago, there was a big fight in the prison and it looked like there'd be a full lockdown. This always gets to people, but there was also an incident in the workshop when a new officer turned up and actually did his job, meaning he told Mitchell not to get too close to the prisoners, especially Matt. She huffed and puffed and slammed a few doors, and she did wonder if the prison was somehow onto her. It got worse when the officer told her to get away from Matt's workstation even though she told him there was no work to do right then. This was harassment. She shouted at him, "Leave my freaking inmates alone." If they don't have any freaking work, they can't do no work now, can they? The officer shot back, "Ma'am, I'm security. We can't be having this in the shop." What a bully, she thought. How dare he? She kept quiet, though knowing that any more trouble could get in the way of the guys escaping. She couldn't sleep for a few nights after that. Week 85. The last time she got to talk with Matt, he tells her, "If you're not there, we're dead. They're going to kill us, you understand? They're going to kill us." She nods her head like a chastised child. June 5th, 2015. Hour 1, the day of the escape. The inmates on the honor block are surprised when Matt gives away his color TV. In the next cell, Sweat puts all his things together in a guitar case. Clothes, new boots, 20 packs of peanuts, 40 granola bars, and 12 sticks of pepperoni. He doesn't know it yet, but they're going to need that food in a big way. Hour 23. The two leave through their holes. They follow the tunnels and are on their way. Sweat leaves the smiley face note and another one with a picture of an alien. "Are you trying me, punk?" he's written on the picture. It's stuck to a metal surface with a stolen magnet. Another kick in the teeth for the authorities. When they arrive at the steam pipe, Sweat enters and makes it through easily. Matt gets stuck, so Sweat has to throw a sheet and drag him out. When Matt comes out of the other end, his pants are down. Sweat smiles and says, "Oh, Matt, I didn't know you cared." It's 11:50, a bit too early, but they get out through the manhole anyway and wait on the road. Under his breath, Sweat says, "Shawshank ain't got nothing on me." It's true. This is better than any Shawshank escape. It's the greatest escape in U.S. prison history, but it's not over yet. Sweat knows that they don't look too sketchy standing there in the street, even if they are wearing prison-issue pants. They have a guitar case, and let's face it, who escapes from prison with a guitar? They're just two guys who have been out playing with their band. Hour 24. Things then take a turn for the worse. Matt sees a car coming down the street and he bolts into someone's garden. Sweat just stands there thinking, why the hell's he running? The driver sees Matt, gets out of his car and shouts, "Hey, what are you freaking scumbags doing in my yard?" Sweat replies, "Oh man, I'm sorry, I apologize. We were just cutting through, we were on the wrong street." Thankfully, the guy seems to believe him even though there's a prison just up the street. The guitar case must have worked. This guy will later tell the cops, who escapes with a guitar case? But Matt is wired as hell and every time he thinks he hears a car, he bolts again. This is making Sweat very anxious. "Rick," he says, "just act normal. We are normal, we're civilians." Matt has issues, mental health issues. And inside the prison, that hasn't always been obvious to Sweat. Now that they're on the outside, he sees the desperation in Matt. He knows he'll strike first and ask questions later, if anyone should even look like they're getting in the way. 24 hours, 50 minutes. Why does Mitchell fail to turn up? And who exactly are these two convicts now free to do what they want on the outside? They both curse under their breaths. Unbelievable. She backed out. This is what love means to her, thinks Matt, who's offended even though he'd gladly cut her head off with a blunt knife. Where is she? What's happened? Earlier that day, at 3:30 p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell clock off from work and head home, stopping for something to eat on the way. In her purse are those pills. She's panicking, and all through dinner she can't eat a thing. Lyle sits opposite, as always, concerned about her. "Are you okay, Tilly?" he says. She ignores him, as she always does. When they're home, she says she feels strange. It's a feeling she's never had before. She's dizzy. Her heart is beating faster. Something's wrong. What's happening to me, she thinks. It's a panic attack. The first one she's ever had in her life. Lyle tells her to sleep it off, but when she wakes about 9 p.m., it's starting to happen again. Lyle then drives her to the ER, where the guys are waiting on the street. At midnight, she's in the hospital. At 2 a.m., she tells Lyle, "You go home. I'll be okay here by myself." In her mind, when he goes home, he's going to meet with two men with a history of violence. She believes they're going to kill Lyle because that's the plan. They'll then take the car and drive away. The next morning, she's surprised when Lyle turns up at the hospital and says he's taking her home. He gives her a big hug and she looks over his shoulder, wondering what the hell's going on. Now, we must explain something. Two men are on the loose and they will not go back to prison, never mind what it takes to stay out. You need to know why they're in prison in the first place. Both of them had horrid upbringings, but Matt's was arguably worse. He was in and out of foster homes as a child, and when he did see his family, it was often in an environment of extreme violence. By the time he was a teenager, he was already stealing cars, taking drugs, and beating people up, including women. He escaped from the children's home, and later he escaped from jail. One time in jail, he agreed to kill another inmate's wife and children, for a price, of course. That inmate turned out to be an informant, but if that plan had gone through, Matt could have murdered innocent people. On December 3rd, 1997, Matt and another guy turned up the house of William Rickerson, Matt's former employee. Rickerson ran a food brokerage firm and Matt knew he always kept lots of cash. It was a cash business with hefty takings. Matt needed some money, wanting to head to Canada where his stripper girlfriend was waiting. The guy, getting on in age, had always liked Matt and tried to help him any way he could. It was this trust that helped Matt get into his house. He punched his frail body as soon as he walked through the door and then started looking for the cash. Matt grew angrier when he couldn't find any, tying Rickerson's hands and feet and beating him around the face. They then kidnapped him and shoved him in the trunk of their car. They stopped the car on the highway and opened the trunk. Matt punched Rickerson, stabbed him in the leg, and demanded to know where the money was. The old guy said he had no money. He'd never had a safe or anything like that. After 27 hours of intermittent torture, Matt started to believe him. There was no money. But now Rickerson would go and tell the cops, and Matt would end up back in prison. Looking at Rickerson covered in blood and bruises, Matt slammed the trunk. The next time he opened it, he strangled him. He pulled the dead body out of the trunk at the side of the road and covered it with sticks. Later, Matt returned to the scene of the crime with a hacksaw, did the dismembering, and threw bits into the Niagara River. He then fled to Mexico, where he later stabbed an American engineer while they were both in a bathroom. The guy died, and Matt got away with only a few bucks. The Mexican cops later arrested Matt, and in 2007, the Mexican government extradited him back to the U.S. A report said he'd been a difficult prisoner and had tried to escape, getting shot at a few times doing so. The Mexicans didn't want him. No one wanted to be near him. Even his own former attorney in the U.S. said Rick Matt was fun, but dangerous guy to hang around with. In court, Matt heard his parole was up in 2032, when if he survived, he'd be an old man. God, he hated prison. When a detective who'd known Matt all his life heard that he had escaped from prison, he said it's not a good feeling to know he's out there. Anything's possible with Rick Matt. Sweat was not anywhere close to Matt in terms of danger, but he too had a troubled youth, not afraid of using violence. He was always known as the brains of the operation when he and others committed burglaries. But he also got caught and, like Matt, did some time in prison early in life. Then on June 4, 2002, he and two other guys were on their way trying to deliver some firearms they'd stolen when a young sheriff's deputy pulled them over. This man had a wife and two young children at home. A guy sleeping in his house nearby heard 3 pops, which startled him from his sleep. Soon after, he heard a car screeching. He put on some clothes and went to see what was up. He found the young cop lying in the park on the tarmac, his body horribly twisted from being run down by a car. As he lay on the floor, the car had reversed over him, and he still wasn't dead though. He pleaded for his life and cried out that he had kids at home, and then one of the guys fired 2 bullets into his face. Sweat later admitted in court that he had fired the first shots at the officer, but not the 2 that hit him in the face. He said he only fired back because the officer pulled a gun on him first. Sweat hit him once, but it was just a nick. The court heard that after that, the driver reversed over him. Sweat got out and said, I'm sorry, only for the other kid to fire those bullets. The family of the victim wanted Sweat and his friends executed, but after a guilty plea, he got life behind bars. He always felt bad about what had happened that night, but he also believed he didn't deserve to grow old in prison. His friends were crazy, not him. Sweat's sentence was life without parole, so the thought of escaping never left his mind. Day 2 after the escape. Mitchell's under suspicion soon after police find the tunnel and talk to prison officers and other inmates. Sweat and Matt are covering as many miles as possible, sticking to the woods. Everyone's after them, the cops, the U.S. Marshals, the FBI, the border cops, and the Rangers. A $75,000 reward is on their backs, and people are told to approach with great caution. I have no idea, says Mitchell, when the state cops ask her if she knows where Matt and Sweat might be. They don't know she's involved, but they have a good idea she is. The prison staff have already talked about all her close relationships with the pair and her habit of taking things in for them. She pretends to be as shocked as anyone, saying at one point, how the hell did they get out of Clinton Correctional? Because I've never heard anybody getting out of here. That's why how did they even escape out of here? She is as bad an actress as she is a wife. The next day she cracks up a little bit, saying, okay, I might have brought some stuff in for them, but I never knew what they were up to. She certainly doesn't admit to planning to go with them and have her husband killed. But as time goes on, she folds. She admits most of the story, but not everything. The only ones who know the full story are the ones on the run. On June 12th, Mitchell is arrested on a felony charge of promoting prison contraband and misdemeanor criminal facilitation. Little by little, over many hours of interview, she talks more and more about what really happened. Days 4 through 10. Even with hundreds of people looking for them and bloodhounds scouring the local forests, the pair managed to evade the authorities. It's believed they're heading to Canada, but it could be Mexico, or they could just be staying put. No one really knows. What is actually happening is they have found a cabin in the woods, and it looks like it's not being used for a long time. There, they get some needed rest and some food, and they even find a 20-gauge shotgun. Sweat thinks again the angels must be watching over him. He's vindicated in this respect again when he goes to the bathroom and finds a loaded pistol hidden above the door. They find something else too, but at this, Sweat is not impressed. There's a big stash of booze that Matt soon starts swigging down in enormous quantities. Sweat's trying to get them to freedom, and it's as if Matt doesn't care. He's getting wasted like a teenager who's found the key to the family booze cabinet. Matt says he needs it. They've walked and run around 30 miles already. Both have blisters on their feet and cuts and bruises on their bodies. When Sweat reprimands him, the much larger Matt gives him a look that says, I've killed people for less. Know your place, little guy. But again, Sweat realizes that Matt is very unstable and he's certainly not the type of man you want to fight. He doesn't dare say anything when Matt refuses to stop drinking the next day or even turn off the TV he's always watching. Day 11 and 12. They can't stay in the cabin forever, so they head off. Now though, Matt's half-baked and he can't keep up. When Sweat loses his temper, again there's a threat of violence. Matt still has the shotgun, and Sweat has the pistol. It's around this time that Palmer's charged with a bunch of felony crimes all related to the things he's done for the guys. He will resign from his job, spend 6 months in jail, and pay $5,000 in fines. Day 20. They're both waiting at the side of the road when Matt says he's going to hold up a car with a rifle. Bad idea, thinks Sweat. He pleads with him not to do it. It will attract unnecessary attention, and he also knows that Matt will not think twice about killing someone. That's not what Sweat wants. Nonetheless, Matt waits in the woods close to the road with his gun, still drunk. Sweat shakes his head. They'll never work, he thinks. And so he runs, and he runs, and he runs, and he runs. They've already covered 50 miles, but Sweat has the energy of an athlete after doing what he did under the prison. As he's taking off, a car has seen Matt and reported him to the cops. Soon, a U.S. Border Patrol supervisory agent is on the scene. Matt won't run, and he won't go back to prison. He stumbles forward with the gun and takes a bullet from the agent's M4 rifle. As the agent walks toward the body, he can smell booze from yards away. Matt's blood alcohol level is 0.18, a classification that comes with the word mentally impaired. In his final moments, he might just remember those lines in the Bible: "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed." Day 22. Sweat has been running for so long. He's exhausted, but now within 1.5 miles of the US-Canada border. He can almost taste freedom, but then when crossing a hayfield, his luck finally runs out. He's spotted by a state trooper who just so happens to be a firearms instructor. Sweat runs and the officer shouts at him to stop while aiming his gun. He doesn't stop, and a second later he's lying on the ground having taken bullets to the shoulder and arm from a .45 caliber Glock 37 pistol. Sweat's grim future. He will survive, and in time he'll end up in special housing units in the maximum security 5 Points Correctional Facility. This is the place where he'll write up a very cogent escape plan and try to trade it with the prison. This is how someone can escape, he'll tell the warden. "Now I've told you that, can I please see my new girlfriend?" That didn't work out for him, and he was moved to another prison. In 2022, he went on a hunger strike against the terrible conditions he was kept in. A judge ruled that the state could force feed him after being restrained, and drug him if necessary. That's what you get for embarrassing the powers that be and costing the state $23 million. Sweat remains in prison today, and he'll be fully locked down for years to come. Years after the escape, the lovebirds. Lastly, what about Mrs. Mitchell and her dear husband Lyle? She has always denied wanting her husband killed, but the evidence shows otherwise. An official 142-page report states, despite her claims to the contrary, Mitchell took steps consistent with plans to murder Lyle Mitchell. The report states she admitted she took pills from Matt, but in one interview she said she'd forgotten about them, and in a separate interview she said she had flushed them down the toilet. One time she said she's never even been given any pills. That's not what Sweat said, and it's his version of events where we get much of the other story. Mr. Mitchell has always stood by his wife's side despite the criticism he's taken for it. In an interview he said, "Do I still love her? Yes. Am I mad? Yes. All I want is for my wife to be coming home. She would never have gone through with it. That's what she told me, and that she really loved me." Now that's a dedicated husband, or an abused one lacking in confidence. Mitchell was sentenced to 2 1/3 to 7 years in state prison. The report states she was ordered to pay restitution of $79,841 and a 10% surcharge to the state for costs relating to the repair of the walls in Matt and Sweat's cells and pipes and walls in the tunnels. She got out in 2020, soon after she found herself getting takeout food with Lyle. It was just like the old days. In the truck, she looked at Lyle and his familiar buck-tooth smile. The glitch wasn't so bad. A quiet life wasn't so awful. Imagine a man trapped in a room that's 2 paces across and 4 paces long. His bed is a concrete slab with a small rubber mattress and a thin blanket. His desk has only a concrete stool, and no matter where in this tiny room he lingers, his toilet is never further than a few feet away. He hasn't seen the sun in weeks, and when he's allowed outside, he is quickly shuttled to a caged-in area that is just 4 paces across and 8 paces long. Inside is a deflated soccer ball and nothing more. This man is only allowed to write to or receive mail from a very restricted list of individuals, and any outgoing letters undergo intense scrutiny and censorship, taking up to 3 months to be delivered. A reply letter undergoes the same process, and if not rejected outright, will take another 3 months before the man can read it. You're just imagining this cruelty, but for many, it's a daily reality that they have lived in for years. Welcome to H Unit at Colorado's Federal Supermax Prison, otherwise known as Hell on Earth. Isolation, solitary, or special housing units have been a punitive measure employed by prisons for centuries. While in the past a prisoner may have been thrown into solitary on a whim, today in our modern prison system it's supposed to be used only as a punishment for prison offenders or for the safety of individuals who may be at risk within the general population. Though solitary is meant to punish bad behavior and ostensibly to correct it, psychological studies dating back over the last 150 years have consistently shown that solitary confinement is extremely psychologically harmful. Individuals kept in solitary for long amounts of time can develop a form of PTSD and can become extremely averse to loud noises or bright lights. They exhibit extreme antisocial behaviors, which can be counterintuitive when the goal of the incarceration is to correct bad behavior. Instead of teaching an inmate a lesson, solitary confinement can in fact make an inmate even more dangerous and aggressive. In one famous case, an inmate released straight from isolation into parole at the end of his sentence murdered Colorado Department of Corrections Executive Director Tom Clements. The inmate had spent years in solitary confinement, getting only an hour of exercise a day if the staff allowed it, which they often did not, in an outdoors cage where he remained, you guessed it, alone. Then one day he was a free man and promptly took revenge for his treatment. Solitary had turned a dangerous man even more dangerous and had clearly failed its intended purpose. Crime must be punished. That's a basic tenet of any nation which operates under the rule of law. But where is the line drawn between punishment and torture? Many Americans today, on both the left and right of the political spectrum, agree that solitary confinement for extreme lengths of time is inhumane, and the data clearly shows that it's counterproductive to rehabilitation. Yet it remains a popular punishment at many modern prisons. Think back to the man at the start of the show. He lives in a cell that is 2 paces across and 4 paces long, sleeps on a concrete slab, has only a concrete stool to sit on, and lives and eats with his open-faced toilet always within arm's reach. He hasn't been allowed to send or receive mail in months, and on average might look forward to 2 letters a year maximum. The longest conversations he holds are with the guards that bring him his food, and these are over in seconds. He's lived in the same tiny cell for years, and with a life sentence, he will most likely remain there until the day he dies. For most people, that scenario sounds nightmarish, and some part of their humanity still cries out for at least some basic compassion for someone sentenced to life in prison. Keep them locked up by all means, but is it really necessary to keep them imprisoned in such a tiny cell for the rest of their lives? Now, we want you to think about that man again, and ask yourself, what if that man was a terrorist? Would your feelings on his basic rights and treatment change at all? The hypothetical scenario we've been having you think about is not hypothetical at all, but rather a reality for dozens of inmates held at H Unit in Colorado's Federal Supermax Prison. These inmates range from drug lords to major gang leaders and terrorists, and include domestic Christian as well as Muslim radicals. Al-Qaeda operatives live next door to white supremacists who have planned massive acts of violence against minority communities and been caught the same as their Islamic terrorist counterparts. Known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, this is where the federal government sends the most dangerous men in America. For these men, they live life inside a prison that is itself within a prison. Forbidden from contact with the general population, they instead spend 23 hours a day locked up in their tiny cells. Described by a former warden as a clean version of hell, civil rights attorneys have argued that it was more accurately a dirty version of hell. That's because for years the federal government also kept its most psychotic prisoners locked up here, where they mutilated themselves, talked to ghosts, and lived in feces-smeared isolation cells for months at a time. Even for the non-psychotic prisoners though, H Unit is hell on earth. These individuals are subject to what are known as Special Administrative Measures, or SAMs, measures which govern the rights of prisoners who are deemed to pose a serious ongoing threat to public safety and national security. On top of their extreme isolation, SAM prisoners are not allowed any contact with the outside world whatsoever, aside from a very carefully selected and screened number of contacts that typically only include close family members and their attorneys. This is because of the fear that a prisoner may communicate via code to criminal or terrorist organizations around the world. In fact, one such case happened in 2005, when 3 prisoners wrote letters to suspected terrorists in Europe exhorting jihad. The prisoners denied that their letters were anything more than generic personal communications, but the FBI considered the incident a serious security lapse. Now, the people a prisoner under SAM restrictions are allowed to contact is severely limited, and the individual on the receiving end of a letter has to be vetted by federal law enforcement officials before being approved for contact. That makes for a rather short list of people that a SAM prisoner may be able to communicate with, and even then their letters are thoroughly screened and censored, a process which can take months. Replies are also screened just as thoroughly, adding months on the way back. As one prisoner noted, he simply gave up writing letters to his mother, as it would take 3 months for her to receive it and 3 months for him to receive a reply. These prisoners are afforded very limited phone calls, and the ones they are allowed to place are extremely restricted and very closely monitored by FBI and Bureau of Prisons, who listen to every word. Even then, phone privileges are very few and far between, which makes keeping up with the lives of loved ones practically impossible. Until only recently, SAM prisoners were not allowed to watch news broadcasts at all, for fear that modern-day events might inflame some radical thoughts and behavior. Of what limited television time a prisoner may have, which is afforded only to SAM inmates who have earned Tier 3 privileges after years of good behavior, channels are often simply blacked out. Things such as newspapers and magazines are on a 30-day delay, and political articles are ripped out of the magazines before being given to prisoners. Day-to-day life involves their tiny 75-square-foot cell where they stay for 23 hours a day. While they're supposed to be allowed 1 hour of outside recreation per day, often this doesn't happen if the short-handed staff is too busy or if they simply don't feel like allowing the prisoner out. When they do get to experience their 1 hour of rec, they must do so in a metal cage that is approximately 4 paces wide and 8 paces long, or about twice the size of their cell. Often prisoners can enjoy a basketball hoop and a deflated soccer or basketball. Still, for men who have spent a decade or more being locked up alone in a tiny cell, just being outdoors again is a reward enough. H-Unit prisoners do not have their own shower as most solitary units do, and instead they are escorted to a shower several days each week. However, this too can be disrupted by lockdowns or staffing issues. One prisoner, Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalab, otherwise known as the failed underwear bomber, explained what his life inside H-Unit was like recently. He claimed that prison staff harassed him for his religion and did their best to disrupt his practice of it. He says that he was given no access to a halal diet, and corrections officers would often mock him and desecrate both his Quran and prayer rug. He also says that he was subjected to humiliating strip searches in front of female staff, something deeply offensive for devout Muslims. If the list of abuses sounds familiar, it's because many of these same abuses were being regularly carried out on prisoners in the infamous Abu Ghraib prison by U.S. service members. Abdul-Muttalab was also forbidden from praying with others in his religion's mandatory group prayers, and he had little if any access to the contracted imam. While he used to be housed in a regular super-maximum security prison, once he was moved to H-Unit, contact with many of his friends and relatives with which he'd been allowed to correspond for years was cut off, including with his own sister. Books he ordered from Amazon to help him pass the time were also rejected without reason. Curiously, one such rejected book was The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, the Japanese art of decluttering and organizing. Abdul-Muttalab's treatment is hardly unique, and a recent complaint filed in federal court states that Mr. Abdul-Muttalab experiences life in H-Unit at ADX as a struggle to avoid becoming mentally ill. The stories of other prisoners brought to life by the federal complaint paint a picture of life at H-Unit as a slow journey into oblivion, a relentless whittling away of family ties, memories, hopes, and even a sense of self. Nidal Ayad, another inmate, says that if he had heard some of the stories of what happens inside H-Unit 5 years ago, he would have thought that they were crazy. But now he tells of prisoners so deeply disturbed by their years of isolation that they warn him to turn off his cell's light because it emits harmful radiation. These prisoners live inside dark cells day and night, and some even claim that hot water is poisonous and harmful. Clearly, the mental stress of living in isolation has created a host of psychological problems for these individuals. It can be easy to disregard these complaints and simply write off H-Unit's inmates as nothing more than the scum of humanity, who deserve exactly what they're getting. And with some of the world's most dangerous drug lords, gang leaders, and terrorists locked up inside, it's tempting to agree with the sentiment. Yet the conditions inside H Unit speak loudly about our own values. But we shouldn't let the hatred and violence of others compromise our own values and the nation we strive to be. Justice must be served and evil must be punished. But how we do these things speaks more about who we really are as a society than our laws do. All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. If you saw part 1 of the show, you'll have heard those words. They were spoken by a doctor who entered a prison in the USA loaded with chemicals to test on humans. Imagine that. You've been punished, are serving time, and then you're punished again because someone has been given the green light to use your skin as a testing surface. Much of the time when such prisoners are used in testing, they agree to do it. But often in the past, what they weren't told is exactly what was being tested and the possible dangers involved. Let's now have a look at how this was done. It's ancient history. We're gonna start with a man that's sometimes called the father of anatomy. That's a compliment, of course, but his ways could have been said to have been rather unethical. We're talking about a Greek physician called Herophilus of Chalcedon. We're told that this physician did occasionally use dead people for his work in understanding the human anatomy, but that didn't always happen. The website ResearchGate tells us that in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, looking under the hood of dead folks was plain taboo, but this physician did do it and educated Greece on anatomy like no one had done before. But he also performed what are called live vivisections, which basically means opening up a person while they're well and truly aware of it. A Greek encyclopedist known as Celsus wrote in a 2nd century medical book that Herophilus used around 600 live prisoners for his research. His work was groundbreaking, as we said, and he was a gift to medical science. But as one scientific paper asks, was he a butcher or an innovator? In this paper, Celsus is quoted as saying, Herophilus and Erasistatrus did this in the best way by far. When they laid open men whilst alive, criminals received out of prison from the kings, and whilst these were still breathing, observed parts which beforehand nature had concealed. According to that thesis, this was a kind of execution, but still one that many people at the time thought was very cruel. No kidding. Radiation experiments. If you read the book The Plutonium Files, you can find many examples of when the USA tested dangerous levels of plutonium on American citizens. The US and other countries were trying to develop the atomic bomb, and no one was exactly sure what high levels of radiation would do to a person. Some of these people were patients in hospitals, and some were prisoners. Sometimes they were just sick children, and on one occasion, pregnant women were chosen. In Massachusetts, it's said that 57 kids, many who were mentally retarded, were given oatmeal poisoned with radioactive tracers, and that was conducted by MIT and sponsored by the Quaker Oats Company. This was well after the development of the atomic bomb, and it was all about proving the nutrients in the oatmeal. It sounds like fake news, but it's not. The Smithsonian wrote that these boys were already maltreated and so seen as kids that didn't matter, adding, as part of the study, the boys were fed oatmeal and milk laced with radioactive iron and calcium. In another experiment, scientists directly injected the boys with radioactive calcium. These kids weren't exactly prisoners, but they were in the care of the authorities and didn't have any say in the matter. That same article mentions a few instances when mentally handicapped kids, kids in institutions, minorities, were tested on and given all kinds of ailments. Back to radiation. In all, you can read about hundreds, maybe thousands of people that were made very sick as American scientists tried to figure out how the body dealt with radiation. All these experiments remained top secret until the 90s, when President Bill Clinton said, "It's time we talked about radiation experiment cover-ups." The plague in the Philippines. During the Second World War, the Japanese were trying to figure out how to drop diseases on the USA. But before this time, the US was trying to figure out how to treat major diseases. It's said that while in the Philippines, the US Army, along with scientists, purposely gave 5 prisoners the bubonic plague and caused something called beriberi in another 29 prisoners. 4 of these people died. According to the book, When Doctors Kill, Who, Why, and How, they did this not to try and spread disease, but just to better understand it. That book also says that one particular Harvard professor over there gave other Filipino prisoners cholera. The book says all became very sick and 13 people died. Thankfully, these experiments were investigated and they were called highly unethical. In the book, it's also written that during the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors who had done a lot of awful stuff themselves tried to justify their work by using the American scientists in the Philippines as an example of similar malpractice. torture. We should say here that we haven't purposefully picked out the USA, and no doubt awful experiments have been done elsewhere. It's just that there's a lot of literature available on what the USA has done. We can take torture for example, and as you probably know, many prisoners in the US have been given mind-altering drugs that has had very negative consequences. One of the most famous experiments was at Holmesburg Prison, and it took place with 320 inmates from 1964 to 1968. This is the same prison where that doctor talked about acres of skin. Prisoners there were also subjects for radiation experiments, but the torture experiment we're talking about involved incredibly powerful hallucinogens. The scientists wanted to know how much they could give a person, so they were completely useless. They tested hundreds of people. One person later said of this prison that had become well known for human guinea pigs. He had a dozen or two experiments going on at one time. He turned Holmesburg into the Kmart of human experimentation. It was a real industry. He was talking about the head doctor there. The doctor later told the press that he did everything according to what was asked of him and followed protocol. Even before the place became a giant lab, it was terrible. In 1938, a bunch of prisoners on hunger strike were sent to what were called bake ovens for punishment. It said 4 prisoners roasted to death. But you don't have to go that far back to see how prisoners have been used so the CIA can figure out the effects of torture. When the CIA just a few years back had prisoners holed up at black sites, it wasn't just torturing people to get information. According to a paper written by the Physicians for Human Rights, waterboarding and sleep deprivation and all manner of other tortures were merely tested on prisoners to see how they might best work. How else would they know? They needed living, breathing subjects, and human rights didn't seem to be an issue. Companies were brought in to what the report says was to calibrate the level of pain experienced by detainees during interrogation. The CIA denied this, and the government didn't investigate the matter. Then in 2010, the authorities wanted to know just how effective its active denial system was. This is a powerful laser that can hit a person's body, say people in a riot or a protest, and heat them up. It was first made, though, for war. It was decided that prisoners at Pitchess Detention Center in Los Angeles could be the guinea pigs for the laser. The ray is said to cause intense heat and pain, but when taken off the body, everything goes back to normal. It's also said, though, that there's potential for death, and there might even be some terrible long-term effects, such as eye damage if it gets you there, or even more of a chance of developing cancer. We should add that while this prison took the laser as an experimental trial, it did that to use on people only if they got out of hand. Mutants. Welcome Dr. Karl Heller. This man's experiments were said by one person to have a bit of the Buchenwald touch, meaning they were not unlike some of the Nazi experiments on humans in concentration camps, but this happened in the US. According to Gizmodo, he did the experiments on behalf of the Atomic Energy Commission. He basically radiated the prisoners, but to the extreme. Yeah, that's right, and he told these prisoners from Oregon and Washington that he had to sterilize them after the radiation so they would not contaminate the world with kids. But what he really said was that he was preventing them from passing on what he called radiation-induced mutants. He did in fact sterilize them, but a few of those guys later sued the government. The experiments went on from 1963 to 1973, and each got around $5 for losing the ability to make children, and also got blasted with radiation. There were other similar experiments performed on mostly poor black people, but they were often people suffering from cancer, so not prisoners. What would happen is they would sign up for a trial in which doctors said they were testing radiation and it might cure them of their cancer. This was a lie. What was actually happening is the US government was trying to see what happens to the body when hit by extremely high levels of radiation, far higher than anyone would receive now from radiation therapy. Cow blood. The rejection of the blood was catastrophic. This is what one scientific paper says about this particular study, in which 64 Massachusetts prisoners were injected with cow blood in 1942 after the US Navy had asked for it. Why, oh why, you might be thinking right now. Well, all in the name of science. The same as when 400 inmates at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois were injected with malaria, and the same year 200 female prisoners were given viral hepatitis, or prisoners injected with cancer cells without their consent in the 50s by the renowned oncologist Chester Milton Southam, or as one book says, the long list of prisoners given potentially fatal diseases in the USA in those days. As for the cow's blood, we're told that a Harvard University scientist was asked by the Navy to create a powerful biological weapon. Well, one source says this, but another says it was to purify the process of extracting albumin from blood plasma in order to make better drugs. It's actually quite hard to find information about this, but some sources say the catastrophic events we mentioned ended with the death of 64 prisoners. We found another paper that said this: 2 prisoners at the Norfolk County Jail died of serum sickness induced by the infusions of crystalline bovine albumin. Harvard medical students were admitted to the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital and bled until they went into shock. Whatever the case, everyone agrees on catastrophic. If we extended this show to include more experiments performed on minorities, poor kids, mentally handicapped kids, sick people, pregnant women, mentally ill people, we could have gone on and on. A man has just been arrested by police and is sitting in a room in the station handcuffed to a chair. Sitting in the same room are 3 detectives, so one would presume that this man could not go anywhere. One would be wrong, because this man has lip balm in his pocket, and he uses that to slip his hands out of his handcuffs. He then runs for it, and what ensues is a chase on foot that looks like something from Keystone Cops. This man we are talking about has been called one of the most brilliant escape artists in history, and now you'll see why. The man we're discussing is one Richard Lee McNair, and that escape we just mentioned was certainly not his greatest escape, not by a long way. McNair successfully escaped from the authorities 3 times, but it was his self-mailing escape and his life on the run that made him famous. Let's get back to the start though. In 1987, when McNair was a month shy of his 30th birthday, he made a very bad choice. That bad choice was to try and break into and burgle a grain storage facility in a town called Minot in North Dakota. Why he wanted to do that, we just don't know, because it wasn't as if McNair was unemployed or lacking intelligence. In fact, he had a job as a sergeant at the Minot Air Force Base that wasn't too far from the grain storage place. As McNair's brother once said, he just made some really bad decisions. That brother also said Richard was the smartest guy he ever met. Okay, so he was smart, but that didn't stop him from botching a burglary and shooting 2 men in the process. One of those men died and the other survived. McNair was quickly brought in for questioning, and he gave up a handgun at the same time. It was looking like the cops had their man, and McNair was looking at a life sentence. But as you know, things didn't go exactly as planned. And with the stick of lip balm, McNair decided to test the health and fitness of the local cops. He somehow managed to get out of the room and out of the police station. He proceeded to literally run for his life, something he'd do time and again in the future. He led the cops down a bunch of streets, and then they chased him up the steps of a 3-story building. By this time, there were cops everywhere, and it was one of those "we've got this place surrounded, come out with your hands up" situations. McNair then made another bad choice. He decided not to come out with his hands up and jumped from a 3rd-floor window into a tree. The branch he landed on snapped, and McNair took a nasty fall. Now that McNair was broken, the cops could make an easy arrest. After a stint in the hospital, McNair was housed at Ward County Jail in Minot. It seems that he wasn't too pleased with his new home, and he might have escaped again had the prison guards not found out that he chiseled a couple of cinder blocks loose in his cell. He was eventually sentenced to 30 years for the robbery and given 2 life sentences for murder and attempted murder. Okay, so we have 1 escape and 1 attempted escape, and now we have yet another escape. One that is not even his best escape. After a few years behind bars at the North Dakota State Penitentiary, McNair and 2 other guys managed to escape after crawling through the ventilation shafts. The 2 other guys didn't stay free for very long, but higher IQ McNair dyed his hair and did everything you should do to disguise yourself. He moved around the US for 10 months but was eventually captured. Okay, thought the authorities, it seems that some men you just can't teach, and they marked him as a problem inmate and moved him to the Minnesota Correctional Facility, Oak Park Heights. This place is the state's only level 5 maximum security prison. It houses what the authorities say are the worst of the worst. People with histories of violence or people like McNair, guys with a flair for escape. No one has ever escaped from this place, and there has only been 1 murder in the prison. That's because prisoners are pretty much locked down during their incarceration. So there was no way he was getting out of that joint. He realized that, and so after a few years he joined a sit-down protest that eventually got him moved to the high-security United States Penitentiary, Florence High. Yet again, he realized that it was unlikely that he'd escape from that place, and so he managed to get himself moved to a high-security federal prison located in Louisiana. This was the place where he would perform his pièce de résistance. You see, he got a job in this prison, and that job was to fix torn mail bags so they could be sent back to the post office to be used. All the time McNair was doing this job, he was plotting yet another escape. The date it happened was April 5, 2006. McNair was almost 50 and had spent a good portion of his adult life behind bars for making that stupid choice back in the day to rob a grain facility. That morning, McNair managed to hide inside a pallet that was full of repaired mail bags. The pallet was later shrink-wrapped, and you might wonder just how McNair managed to breathe. Well, the answer is he had created a kind of escape pod, and that included a tube that he could breathe through once he'd secretly pierced the packaging. The pallet was soon taken to a storage facility outside of the prison guards, and there, McNair waited inside his pod. When he heard the workers go for lunch, he got out of the pod and once more ran for his life. So this was lunchtime, and McNair knew very well that officers at the prison wouldn't know he was missing until about 4 p.m. He had 4 hours to run like hell toward the nearest town to get supplies and steal a car. The next part of the story is nothing short of unbelievable. So McNair is running near some railroad tracks, and a cop thinks it's a bit weird and stops him, since the cop knows an inmate is on the loose. The cop asks McNair for ID, to which he replies that he has none. He tells the cop he's just doing some exercise. But then, when he's asked what his address is, McNair says he's staying at a nearby hotel with his brother. The cop then says, "The problem is, we have an escapee on the loose." That's why McNair, who is now calling himself Robert Jones, has been stopped. The two laugh about this, and then the cop radios the station to ask if the subject wears glasses. He also asks for more information about the escapee's appearance. McNair could make a run for it any time, but he just stays there, waiting to see what the cop will do when he's on the radio. The cop explains to the other person on the line that he's looking at a man who's around 50, has bluish eyes, short hair, a goatee beard, and who wears glasses. The policeman says, "Well, you know the bad thing about it, you're matching up to him," to which McNair replies, "Well, that sucks, doesn't it?" Somehow, McNair manages to convince a cop that he's staying at some hotel whose name he can hardly remember, which is close to some construction works. "What's your name again?" the cop asks. McNair makes the mistake of now saying Jimmy Jones. The cop actually sounds apologetic for harassing the jogger and then says, "You wouldn't believe what those guys do. They got years and years to think about how they're gonna do it." McNair must have thought, "Tell me about it." The next few minutes is McNair brilliantly describing the area where he's staying and again convincing the cop that he's staying at some small hotel and he's just out on his daily job. "I promise you, I'm not the escapee," says McNair, to which the cop replies, "You'd have done run by now." And then they both have a laugh about that. "Just don't get run over by a train," says the cop. Soon after, McNair is off again on his run to freedom as the cop says, "Be careful, buddy." He was careful too, and his journey now would shock just about every household in North America. When Christmas time rolled around, McNair did something quite brazen. He actually sent the warden of his former prison a greeting card. The authorities were not too happy about this. McNair had totally embarrassed them, and now he was rubbing pie in their faces. U.S. Marshals put McNair on their 15 most wanted list, and his story appeared on the TV series America's Most Wanted. After over a year on the run, McNair was pulled over in Canada after the police had spotted the stolen car he was driving. At the roadside while being questioned, yet again McNair made a run for it. As you can guess by now, McNair was pretty good at running. He outran the Canadian cops, and it wasn't until 2 days later that they realized that the car thief was that guy that had appeared on America's Most Wanted. The car was more closely examined, and the cops found a camera. On that camera, there was lots of self-portraits of McNair. He hadn't been doing selfies out of narcissism, he'd been planning on making fake IDs. Investigators also found McNair's fingerprints in the car. The chase was on again. A few more days passed, and McNair had stolen a motorbike and had already covered a lot of ground in the province of British Columbia. He then really hit the gas after stealing yet another car. To keep the authorities at bay, he crossed back into the US and drove across a few states. He then decided to drive back into Canada and drove all the way from Ontario to Vancouver. He planned to settle down in northern British Columbia at a place called Williston Lake and was about to buy some property there until he found out that there'd been a pine beetle infestation in the area. He was also concerned that there weren't enough good escape routes if the cops should ever show up. If you're wondering how he managed to get the money to buy a property and survive on the run all that time, the answer is he stole a lot of cars, and we mean a lot. You see, he had once worked as a car showroom salesman, and he knew how to steal cars from those places without getting caught. He would take brand new cars, ones without GPS, and he would try to steal white cars because they usually blended in better. He would use those cars for a while, and then he'd sell them. That's how he got his cash. He appeared 12 times on America's Most Wanted, and there was even an 11-page piece written up about him in the New Yorker. He'd later say that he was surprised that he'd become so famous, or infamous. This was a problem for him, since just about everyone in North America who owned a TV knew what McNair looked like. But he managed to use computer technology to create driver's licenses, and he also changed his appearance a lot. He even had laptops that he used just for solely monitoring what the press was saying about him. His downfall was his own ingenuity in the end, because he was captured when a Canadian cop noticed a van that seemed to have homemade tinted windows. McNair had made those tints himself, but the cop was suspicious because the van looked really expensive. The cop took the plate number and called it in. The next day, a young Canadian policeman who'd been on the job 6 weeks spotted McNair's van. A chase ensued, and when the van was cornered yet again, McNair took off on foot. But this time, he was being chased down by a young, fit cop. McNair didn't get very far. The cop was later given an award, and in interviews he said McNair laughed and joked with him after he was captured. The game was up now, and the running man was about to face extradition to the U.S. McNair now resides in ADX Florence, a Supermax prison where inmates are locked down 23 hours a day, and when they do leave their cell, they're surrounded by guards. This facility is one place that no man can escape from. That's why it houses international and domestic terrorists, spies, leading gang members, as well as infamous organized crime members, and the likes of one El Chapo Guzman. In fact, McNair once talked about El Chapo, and we know that because a Canadian journalist who's been writing to McNair for a long time sometimes posts what McNair says in letters on Twitter. One tweet went like this: "I've been a 10-year resident of ADX Florence, and I see a new resident is coming, El Chapo. I look forward to meeting you and sharing breakout stories." If you read that Twitter account, you'll also know why McNair always ran so well. That's because he worked out every single day when he was behind bars. Now you need to watch this video, the most insane ways men escape from prison, or go and watch this.